you want to make something that truly sets you apart from AI? While AI is getting better at cranking out basic code, what it can't do is craft those jaw-dropping websites that make people say, wow. That's where this tutorial comes in. This isn't just another coding video. This is your chance to create something to help show off your skills and stand out from the crowd. Imagine showing your work to a client or an interviewer. Picture their faces lighting up as they ask, how did you make this? That's what happens when you make something magical. By the end of this video, you'll have a landing page that doesn't just look great. It will also come alive with every scroll and click, drawing people in to explore. And the best part? When you're done, you'll have a project that shows everyone you're way better than any robot. You're a creator who brings ideas to life on screen. Are you ready to build something amazing? Let's take a look at what we'll be building. Welcome to Sphereal, a fully responsive AI-themed landing page designed to capture attention and engage users like never before. Let's take a minute to show you everything you'll create. Starting in the hero section, we'll create a stunning introduction with planets that react to the movement of your cursor. As you scroll down past the hero image, chat bubbles will create a smooth parallax effect that brings the section to life. Below that, the list of companies will animate on and off the screen with an infinite scroll effect that's not only eye-catching, it's mesmerizing. In the features section, we'll surround the site logo with an orbit of different tools that adds visual interest. The pricing section will be enhanced with micro interactions that bring delight to the user experience. We'll bring the testimonials to life with fluid animations, where each one will have a silky smooth entrance and exit, making sure they're noticed and remembered. For the call to action section, we'll mirror the hero by showing planets that react to your cursor as they gracefully glide across the screen. And finally, we'll build a simple, functional footer with working navigation, tying everything together seamlessly. Of course, everything will be fully responsive, ensuring the site looks amazing no matter the device. To bring this futuristic page to life, we're using some of the most powerful cutting-edge tools available. The first is React. It allows us to build interactive components while keeping our code clean and organized. We're supercharging React with Nextjs. Think of it as strapping a rocket to an already lightning-fast car. Nextjs brings static site generation, giving your site the kind of performance that Google's algorithm loves. None of this will be complete without talking about styling. For this site, we're using TailwindCSS, which is a game changer. Instead of wrestling with CSS for hours, Tailwind lets us style components on the fly without ever leaving our markup. It's like having a coding superpower at our fingertips. On top of that, we're using Framer Motion, the special sauce that allows us to build animations that seem almost magical. But let's not forget about other tools you'll gain experience with in this course, including Typescript, Class Variance Authority, and SVGR. This tech stack isn't just a collection of trendy tools, it's a carefully curated selection designed to give you the edge over AI. By mastering these technologies, you won't just keep up with AI, you'll become a coding machine so good you'll make even Claude green with envy. Now, if you're feeling overwhelmed, don't worry. Not only will I guide you every step of the way, but I'll also be providing everything you need to get started for free by clicking the link in the description. When you click that link, you'll get a treasure trove of free resources designed to help you complete this project. You'll get the fully responsive designs showing you in pixel perfect detail what to build. You'll also get the starter template so you can hit the ground running with a pre-configured setup. On top of that, you'll have access to every image and icon used in the course to help your project truly shine. Everything you need is right there, free of charge. Now, this is part 2 of this video series, so if you haven't seen part 1 yet, I recommend going back and watching that video first. You can find the link for that video in the description below. So are you ready to transform your skills, supercharge your portfolio, and take a giant leap forward in your career? We're going to do all of that in this course. Without further ado, let's code. Now that we've completed our feature section for now, let's go ahead and move on to the pricing section. As we can see, we have 3 different pricing plans: basic, premium, and enterprise. And each one of these is going to look a little bit different. They're going to have different colors up here on the titles. They're going to have different prices. They're going to have slightly different button styles depending on the pricing plan that's available. And they're going to have different features for each pricing plan. We also are going to want to account for the difference in height of the premium plan versus our basic and enterprise. So you can see the premium plan just comes up a little bit higher than the other two. So we'll definitely want to make sure that we're accounting for that in the desktop view.
Over in our tablet view, as we scroll down and look at the pricing plan, now we're stacking these pricing plans on top of each other. So we're keeping the same general look and feel to them, but we are stacking them, and we just want to make sure that they don't get too wide for this screen size. So we'll want to make sure that we keep them within a container to ensure they don't get too wide on this screen size. And then over in the mobile view, as you might expect, we're still keeping them stacked, but we're just ensuring that they don't get too close to the edges of the screen. But other than that, these are going to look pretty similar to what we're seeing on the other sizes. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the pricing section. As we come into our code, of course, the first thing that we're going to need to do is hook up a pricing section into our page. So we'll come into the sections directory, and then we'll open up the pricing section and take a look at the code that's already in this particular section. I'm going to close out my sidebar for just a second. We can see that we have the pricing tiers data that's available to us via an array. It has a title, description, price, button text, features, color, and class name. So all of that will be helpful for us in order to be able to properly show our prices in our pricing section. And then coming down to the bottom, we have the actual pricing section itself that has the words pricing section within a section tag. In order to hook that up to our page, I'm going to open up my sidebar one more time and come into the source/app/page.tsx. And we're going to go ahead and import that pricing section that we have there in the sections directory. So I'm going to import pricing from @/sections/pricing. And then I can just drop that in below my features section. So I'm just to drop in pricing here with a self-closing tag. And then as soon as we save that, we should see the words pricing section there at the bottom. Now that we have that working, I'm going to go ahead and close out my page.tsx file and open up my pricing file so that we can work within this particular file. Let me also close down my sidebar again so that we have more room to be able to see our code. In order to be able to see our design beside our pricing section, I'm going to use a technique that I've done in my other sections. I'm going to just go ahead and add a class name of PB 1000 pixels here, and that will just add a little bit of padding bottom so that as we scroll, we can go ahead and see what's over here to the right. Now that we have all that in place, let's go ahead and start creating the code for our pricing section. So I'm going to remove the words pricing section and go ahead and start adding in the content for this section. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a div with a class name of container. Of course, we'll need that to ensure that the content of this section is not bumping up against the sides of the screen. After that, we do know that we're going to use our section border component. So I'm just going to drop that in with the section border component here. Inside of that, we'll also have our section content. We'll go ahead and use that component that we already have created for that particular purpose. And then we can actually start to create the actual section content itself. Inside of that, we'll have the title, which will be a semantic H2 tag, and that's going to say flexible plans for every need. And then below that, we'll start to have our pricing cards. So we can add those in by just going ahead and adding a div wrapper and then mapping over our pricing tiers. So I'm going to say pricing tiers here dot map. And then for each of those pricing tiers, of course, we're going to be pulling out the particular data for that tier, and we're going to be showing some JSX inside of a div. So we can just map over these tiers, and then we can just pull out the individual tier. And then inside of that, we'll then be able to start adding the content for our pricing card. So the first thing I'm going to add is an H3 for the title. That's going to have the content of tier.title. We also want to make sure real quick that our div has the right key to keep React happy since we are mapping over these pricing tiers. So I'm going to say tier.title is going to also be the key as I map over my different pricing cards. Below that, we'll have the description. That can be a semantic paragraph tag, and we'll say tier.description. Below that, we have the actual price itself for our pricing card. So we can put that inside of a div, and we can just output tier.price. Below that, we'll have a button to get started. We can use our button component that we have already created. And inside that button, we'll just have the button text. So tier.button text should allow us to show the button itself. And then we should have each of our features below that. That'll be in a semantic UL tag. And for each one of those features, we'll have an LI. So tier.features.map. And we can just take each feature and go ahead and map over that as an LI. So I'll just have an LI here. And then inside of that, we'll just output the feature itself. And we'll also have a key of feature to keep React happy as we map over that. Now that we have the content for this section on the screen, let's see if we can go ahead and start to style some of this content up. So for our H2, we'll go ahead and add a class name on here, and that's going to say text 3XL for the font size. We'll also want to say font semi-bold for the font weight. We'll say text center to make sure that it's pushed towards the center of the screen, and text gray 200 should make it a little bit lighter and make it the right color. For our pricing tiers themselves, we'll want to push those down from the title. So we'll give the outer wrapper a class name as well. And we'll just say MT12 to give that 48 pixels of top margin that should push those pricing cards down to the right spot. For the pricing cards themselves, we'll also want to add a class name to each one of those wrappers, and we'll want those to have a border with the color of the custom value of var color border should make that the right color. Let me go ahead and save that to double check, and it does look like it is. And then I'll say rounded 3XL so that we have the 24 pixels of border radius. And then we'll want to add some padding with PX6 and PY12 to add both top and bottom and left and right padding to these cards. For the title, we'll want to change the styles of that as well by adding a class name to the H3 and then saying font semi-bold to bring up the font weight of the title. We'll also want to bring up the size by saying text 4XL, and then we can change the color based on the tier color that's getting passed in. So we can do that with our TW merge function. So I'm going to go ahead and use TW merge here in order to go ahead and merge on some classes based on the particular tier. Of course, I need to import that at the top of my file. So I'm going to come to the top of my file and say import TW merge from Tailwind merge, and that should allow us to then use our Tailwind merge function. Coming back down to my title, we can go ahead and add on the additional classes by checking tier.color and saying if it's equal to violet for the first one, then we can go ahead and add on text violet 400. We also know that we're going to want to account for amber. So if the tier.color is equal to amber, then we'll want to add on our text amber 300, and we'll want to account for a color of teal. So if tier.color is equal to teal, then we'll want to say and text teal 300, and that will add on the right color for that title as well. It looks like our basic title is aligned with what I see over here on my design, which means that we can move down and add some styles to the description. For the description, let's add a class name here as well and say MT4 to move it down by 16 pixels from the title, as well as text gray 400 just to make it a little bit darker than the normal text. Below the description, we need to account for our price. Now, as you can see, we have a couple of different prices here. We have a text-based price, we have a number-based price, and then down on our enterprise level, we don't have a price at all. So we need to account for all three of those pricing styles inside of this code. In order to take care of that, let's first go ahead and take care of the actual price itself. So I'm going to wrap this in a span tag, and then we can just style up our price if it's available. So I'll add a class name to this span tag and make sure that it's the right font size. So I'll say text 7XL for the font size, and then font semi bold for the font weight. We'll also add text gray 200 to make it more like a title font for our price. After I hit save, it looks like my price is the same size and color on the basic level. We also want to make sure it's pushed down from the description. So we'll come to our wrapping div, go ahead and give this a class name as well and say MT8 in order to push it down by those 32 pixels that we're also seeing in our design. For our basic pricing tier, that looks like that aligns everything. But of course, as we come down to our premium pricing tier, we also need to add our $sign here. So we'll go ahead and add another span tag for that $sign and go ahead and add that $sign here and make sure that it's styled up correctly with a class name added here as well. The class name here is going to be text 2XL in order to get the right font size, and also font semi-bold should give it the right font weight. And we'll also want it to be the same color as our price. So we'll say text gray 200 here as well. And then we should be able to align it to the top by saying align top, and hopefully that should put it towards the top of our price. Now we only want to show this particular price if the price is a number. So in order to handle that case, we'll just go ahead and wrap this span tag with a statement that checks that. So we'll say type of tier.price is equal to number and then we can just go ahead and wrap this span tag in that parentheses. After we've done that, let's scroll up to our basic pricing tier and see if we have that $sign added there. It doesn't look like we do. And of course, we'll need to scroll down to our enterprise pricing tier and we will notice that that's also gone from there. So it looks like that type of check took care of only having our $sign if the price was a number. While we're handling these checks, we'll also want to make sure that we have something here for our enterprise pricing tier to ensure that we have the space being taken up by some sort of non-breaking space in this case. So in this case, we'll check for is that we actually have a tier.price, because if we go up to our pricing tiers, what we can see is we have a number here, we have a string, and then for the third one, you can see that the price is null. So to account for that, let's go ahead and scroll down to our actual price and say if tier.price is actually there, then we'll show it. Otherwise, we're just going to go ahead and inside of a React fragment, show a non-breaking space. And that should ensure that the space is still taken up as if the price was there, but we're not actually going to show anything for that particular pricing tier. Moving back up to our basic tier, let's continue on with our styles. So now that we have the price being displayed correctly, let's move on to our button. The button should have a class name as well. This class is going to push it down from the price. We'll say MT8 to push that down with a margin top of 32 pixels. And then we want to make sure that the variant is correct. We'll add a variant here and say that that's going to be equal to tier.button variant. And let's see what the difference is here. So it looks like TypeScript is upset about something. And it looks like why it's not happy is because we have our variant in our data array defined as a string or undefined, when the button variant is defined as specific strings, primary, secondary, or tertiary. So we need to go ahead and make sure that TypeScript understands that anytime we pass in a button variant, that's going to be equal to one of the button variants that we have in our actual button component. So in order to make sure that our pricing tiers satisfy that, we can just say satisfies, and this is a special keyword, and then we can say that this will be equal to an object that has a title of string, a description of string, a price of a string, or it could be a number, or it could be null. The button text is always going to be a string. The button variant is going to be an optional property that's going to be equal to one of the button variants. So let's go ahead and grab those variants from our actual component. So if we go into the button, we've exported these button types in order to be able to use these variants. So I'm going to import those button props and then use that as our type for our button variant. So coming to the top of our file, let's go ahead and import button props from our @/component/button. And then we can use that just by coming down here and saying this is going to be equal to button props variant if it is assigned. For our features, that will just be a string array. For our color, that is going to be a string. And then for our class name, if it's defined, we'll also want to make sure that that is a string as well. And then we also just want to make sure that it knows that it is an array of objects, not just a single object itself. And after we've done that, it looks like TypeScript is happy with the type of our pricing tiers, but it should also be happy with the fact that we've just added this variant on here. Now that it knows that it can't just be any string, it has to be one of the specific variants that we can pass to a button. Now it looks like our button variants are a little bit different than what's in our data array. So we might have to adjust our data array to ensure that the button variant is added on to the basic and premium tier. So I'm going to go ahead and add in our button variant here, and that's going to be secondary for my basic tier. And then for my premium tier, I'm also going to add in button variant, and that's also going to be the secondary variant. After I save that, hopefully we should see our button variants getting changed, and it looks like we do, which means we can then scroll back down to our buttons and see what else we need to change down here in our pricing tier cards. The other thing that needs changed here is we need to add on a block prop to ensure that the button stretches to take up the entire width of the card. So if I add on the block prop, we should see our button gets wider and takes up the entire width. That's all looking good. The last part of this basic card, at least, is making sure that we have each of our features with this icon beside it that will make it look like the design. In order to take care of that, what we'll do is we'll wrap our feature in a span tag so that we can put the icon beside it. So we'll have an ending span tag there. And then inside of that li, we'll go ahead and bring in our font awesome icon. So let me see if I can just start using font awesome icon. I do see that it shows up. We know that the icon is going to be an FA check circle that we can also import from our Fort Awesome free solid SVG icon. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter there. And we are going to give this a class name. So I'm just going to go ahead and add on an empty class name for now. But if I hit save, I should see my icons being added. And yes, indeed I do. But of course, we need to pull down the size of those a lot as well as adjust the color. So I'll say size 6. That should make those 24 by 24 pixels. And then to make them the right color, I can say text violet 400, and that will ensure that they are the right color as well. Now we can see that each of these list items also has a top border. So I'll add a class name to my list items. And in that class name, I'll say border T, and I'll say border and ensure that we have the custom border color here. So that's going to be var color border. That will add the right borders onto that. And then to add a little bit of padding to the top, we can also say PT4, and that should add the padding to the top of each of our list items. We'll also want these to be flexed next to each other, so I can go ahead and add the flex class here, and I should be able to say gap 4, and that will ensure that we have the right gap between our icons and our text. We don't want this circle to ever shrink in size because we're flexing our text and our icon next to each other. So we'll want to say flex shrink 0 here, and that should ensure that our icon is always going to stay the right size. For the text itself, we can see that it's a little bit lighter than the design. So on the span tag, I'll go ahead and add a class name here, and we'll just add a font medium, and that will bring up the font weight just a little bit so we can see it a little bit better. And then for our unordered list, we're going to want to flex this as well. So we'll say class name, and we'll say flex call. That should flex it in the column direction. We'll add a gap of 4 to put 16 pixels of spacing between each of our list items. We'll also want to push this down from the button a little bit. So we'll say MT4, and that should hopefully push that down from the button. And it looks like that's not quite enough. Let me try MT8 and see if that pushes it down the right amount. And that looks very similar to our design. So as I scroll up and down, you can see that everything is pretty close to being aligned. There are a couple of things as I scroll back up that I see we still need to add our border top for this section. So let's scroll up to the top of our pricing section and go ahead and account for that just by on our section borders, giving this the border top prop and hitting save. That should ensure that we have our border top added there. Now that we have things looking pretty much like the design, let's go ahead and overlay our design and see if there's any other changes that we need to make in order to account for any design inconsistencies. It does look like as I scroll down that my card is a little bit blurry, which means that we're probably off by a couple of pixels. And one of the things that it looks like we did for our H2 in our design is we went ahead and set the line height with letting tight just to ensure that the line height was specifically set. And after I do that, what I see in my design versus my actual coded section is things look much more crisp after doing that. So I'm not seeing any problems with my basic card. As we move down though, we haven't yet added any spacing. So if I scroll back and forth, you can see that what I have on my code is on the left and what I have in the design is on the right. We don't have any spacing yet. And actually, let me go ahead and bring this image opacity up a little bit so we can see that a little bit better. We have spacing in our design. We don't have any spacing yet between each of our pricing cards on the left. So that is certainly creating a problem for us right now. So let me go to the div that holds all of my pricing tiers, and we can just say flex flex call to go ahead and flex it in the column direction. And then gap 8 should ensure that we have the required spacing that we need for those particular cards. And after that's added in there, as I swipe back and forth, I'm not noticing any changes in the premium size to my code versus my design. So let me go ahead and bring down the image opacity a little bit again so that we can just go ahead and see as we continue to scroll down if there's any other blurriness or problems. And as I scroll down to the enterprise plan, I still see everything looks like it's aligned perfectly, which means that at the mobile view, I think our coded section is done. So let me go ahead and bring out my image back to side by side, take one more look at these side by side to see if there's any differences between what we have in our code and what we have in our design. But it doesn't look like there are right now. It looks like those are very well aligned. So that means that we should work on our responsive sizes. I'm going to pull my browser window out a little bit, go ahead and close down the sidebar just to give myself a little bit more room to work with. And let's look at our tablet size. So at our tablet size, we can see that our cards don't have any kind of max width container to hold them in place. We'll certainly need to add that in to make it look like the design. So let's go ahead and take care of that. And in order to account for that max width being added, we'll go to each of our pricing tiers and go to the end of our class name and just add a max width small. That should constrain it to 384 pixels. And then MX Auto should ensure that it shows up in the center of the screen, not at the left or the right size. Now, as I scroll up and down a little bit to align my design, you can see that it looks like it's aligned, but I do see that the text at the top for the title for the section is a little bit different than what we have over here on the right. So I'll go over to my H2 and go ahead and add a medium modifier and say text 4XL. That should ensure that that text size is increased according to what is in our design. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and overlay our design on top of our code and see if there are any differences or anything else that we need to account for in this section. I'm not seeing anything so far, so that means that our tablet view should be done. I'm going to pull my reference image back out to side by side and then go over and look at our desktop view. Let me pull my browser window out just a bit more so we can get a better look. So we know that at the desktop view size, we are going to continue to increase our title size, but we also want to put our pricing cards next to each other at this particular size instead of stacked on top of each other. So we'll want to account for both of those things, and then we can check it again by overlaying our reference image on top of what we have. So in order to account for that, we'll want to switch at the large size. We'll turn this into flex row. And then to account for the differences we have with the card, with our premium card coming up a little bit higher than the other ones, we'll want to add the class name that's added onto our pricing tier. So you can see that we have a class name that should account for those differences in spacing. We'll want to go ahead and add that on at this point in time. So I can use TW merge to merge the classes from each of my tiers to what I already have. So let me go ahead and use that. I'll say TW merge here, and then we'll go ahead and end that parentheses, and then we'll add on tier.class name, and that should ensure that our class names get added to each of our pricing cards. And you can see that that does allow our adjustment to happen the way that it looks like it does in the design. After we've done that, let's take another look at this section at the desktop size by going ahead and pulling out our browser and overlaying our reference image on top of this particular section. Now you can see that there's still a couple of changes that we need to make. One of them is the title is definitely bigger in the design than what we see in our code. So in order to kind of look at these side by side, I'll go ahead and pull our image opacity all the way up, and then take our little swiping mechanism that we have here and kind of go back and forth. And we can see that in the design, we definitely have a bigger title. And then in our code, we definitely have a smaller title. So to account for that, let me go ahead and pull my code back out and go to my title. And it says that it's at the medium size, we've gone up to text 4XL, while at the large size, we probably need to go up to text 5XL. So I'll go ahead and set that and see if that helps our title size be aligned to our design. After pulling this back out, I'm going to go ahead and swipe back and forth again. And it looks like we do have it more aligned to our design. Let me go ahead and scroll up and down a little bit to get everything aligned. But our pricing cards aren't quite right. They are a little bit different in size than what we're seeing in our design. So in order to see this a little bit better, I'm going to go ahead and take back down our design opacity. And you can see that essentially what's going on is, even though they start at the right place and end at the right place, our pricing cards are just slightly different in actual size. And that's because part of the sizing algorithm for Flexbox is that it sizes based on the actual content of the cards itself. In this case, we don't want it to do that. We want these to be equal sizes. And the way that we do that is for each of our pricing tiers, we can just tell them to take up an equal size by saying Flex 1. That should ensure that each of these takes up exactly the size that they're supposed to take up. And as you can see, as I pull my browser window back out and look at this, now they are aligned to what I'm seeing in my design. The only difference now is that these are actually growing to each be the same height as well. And in this case, we don't want that to happen because our design has them stopping a little bit shorter. And right now our cards are growing a little bit longer. And that's also due to the way that Flexbox works. Flexbox wants to make them the same size. We can ensure that doesn't happen at the large size by going ahead and just saying items, start, and that should ensure that we're kind of pushing those towards the top of our flexed row. After we do that, I can see that we have everything aligned on our desktop size. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull back out my reference image over to side by side and take one more look to make sure everything still looks good. And I think that it does. Scrolling back and forth, it looks like everything looks good on that size. And as I scroll over to my tablet size, I see that everything still is looking good over here as well. I can even overlay the reference image on top and go ahead and scroll up and down. It still looks like everything looks great there. And then over on the mobile size, everything is looking good over here as well. So now that all of that is taken care of, let's come back into our code. Let me go ahead and push my browser window over to the side again, come back into my code. We don't want to have this padding bottom added on anymore because that is not useful for us anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and take that class name off. But other than that, I believe this pricing section is done. It's time for us to move on to the next section of the page. Moving below the pricing section on our landing page, we get down to our testimonials. So you can see that our testimonial has this nice gradient border similar to what we have on our buttons. We also have the text of the testimonial itself. We have a picture, a name, a title, and then we have these 4 dots that will allow us to change between different testimonials, as well as this opening quote up here that we'll definitely have to account for as well. Coming into our tablet view and scrolling down to our testimonials, we can see that we have changed the layout a little bit. Now we're putting our text on top of our quote author, but we are still leaving our dots over here to the right side at this view size. And then down in the mobile view, we've done this a little bit differently as well, because now our dots are now underneath and we have our text, our author, and our dots down there at the bottom. We are making sure that we're not touching the edges of our container. So we'll want to make sure that we account for that. But other than that, let's go ahead and dive into the code. To get started coding out our testimonials, let's come into source/section/testimonials and take a look at what we have inside of our section already. So we have all of our 4 testimonials as a data array. You can see each of those has a quote, a name, a title, and an image. And then down at the bottom, we have exported the section as a const, and that just has a section tag with the testimonials section words inside of it. So in order to link that up to our page, let's come into our app/page.tsx, and then we can import that like we've done with our other sections. So we'll import testimonials from @/sections/testimonials. And then after we've done that, we should be able to drop our testimonials section at the bottom of our page. And as soon as we hit save, we should see the words testimonials section at the bottom of our page, which we do, which means we can close out our page.tsx, go back to our testimonials section, and then work exclusively in this file. I'm going to close out my sidebar so I have a little bit of extra room. And like my other sections, I'm going to add some padding bottom to this section so that we can see the design to the right as we're working on this. So I'll say PB 1000 pixels, and that should ensure that we have a little bit of space to be able to see the design as we are working. I'm also going to pull out my browser window a little bit so that I can see my design as I'm coding up the content for this section. After that, let's go ahead and remove the words testimonial section. We certainly don't need those anymore. And we'll go ahead and add our container. Let me add a div class name equals container that will hold our section content in. We also need our section border component. So I'll add in section border And as I hit enter, that should import this into this section. We'll also want our section content. So section content. And inside of our section content is where we'll put the actual content of our section itself. We know that we're going to have a div that's going to be the border for our testimonials. Inside of that, we're going to have a semantic block quote tag. And that block quote tag is going to have the quote itself. That's going to be in a semantic paragraph tag. And that quote is going to directly come from our testimonials array. Now, there are a couple of ways that we can do this as we're coding this up. We could go ahead and just copy and paste the content that we see up here in our first testimonial, or we could go ahead and map and only show the first one. I think what I like is the second approach, where we go ahead and map over all of our testimonials and then just tell React that we only want to see the first one by going ahead and selecting that with some sort of use state. So in order to do that, all we need to do is go ahead and say testimonials.map here. And then for each of our testimonials, we can just add a testimonial variable there. And then we'll go ahead and output some JSX for each of these testimonials. Inside of that, we'll just go ahead and copy and paste our block quote tag into that testimonial array. And then we'll go ahead and add a key of testimonial.name is probably the easiest way to do that. After we've done that, we can go ahead and drop our testimonial inside our paragraph. So we'll say testimonial.quote inside of that paragraph. Now we are going to get all of the quotes showing up. Of course, we're going to get all of the content showing up because we're mapping over our testimonials. So in order to be able to say which one we want to see, let's go ahead and create that use state. Now I need to come up to the top of my component and say use client, because as soon as we use state from React, we are going to have to tell Next.js that this is a client component that has some sort of state attached to it. Now, an easy way for us to go ahead and select our testimonial without having to worry about use state or any of the other things that we're going to have to worry about in the future is just to be able to go ahead and have a simple constant. So we can say const selected testimonial index, and that can just be equal to 0. That way, as we're mapping over, we can pull out the index of the testimonial and then use that to basically say if the selected testimonial index is equal to the current index of the testimonial we're looking at, then we'll go ahead and show it just by going ahead and outputting our block quote and everything else that we need. Now, if we do that, we'll also need to move our key around our testimonial as well. So we can do that with a simple React fragment. So I'll just go ahead and add a React fragment around our testimonials. And then we can just say inside of here, key equals testimonial.name. And in order to be able to use it this way, we'll probably also want to say react.fragment here. And we'll say the same thing with our ending react.fragment. And that will ensure that our fragment has the right key. So essentially what we're doing is we're instantiating a fragment for each of our testimonials, going ahead and giving it a key, but then only outputting any content if the index of this particular testimonial, so 0, 1, 2, or 3, is equal to the one that we've already selected. Now, in the future, we're going to have some state and we're going to be able to change it via the state, but for now, we're only outputting 1 because we're just going ahead and matching our design, which is only showing the first testimonial for now. So now that that's in place, you can see that we're only seeing the first text or the first quote for our first testimonial, which is exactly what we should be seeing for this content. After the quote, we'll have our citation. So I'll use a cite tag to wrap that citation. Inside of that, we'll have our image. So for that, we can use next/image. We'll have the source equal to our testimonial.image. The alt tag is going to be equal to testimonial.name. And we'll add the styles for that later, but I'll just go ahead and save that and see if we see the image show up, which indeed we do. Below that, we'll go ahead and have a div for the actual name. So I'll say testimonial.name there in that div. And then below that, we'll also have their title. That'll be in a div as well. So we'll say testimonial.title. After the testimonials themselves, we'll want to come out of here and go ahead and create another div that's going to hold the selection dots that we see on the screen. So for those, we're also going to map over our testimonials. But in this case, we don't really want any data from the testimonial, so I can just go ahead and add an underscore. All we really want is the index itself. And then for each of those, let's go ahead and output some JSX, but that's just going to be a div that wraps our dot And then inside of that div, we'll have the div for the dot itself. So just a couple of divs there. And then we also need to add a key. So I'll say key equals, this key will be a little bit easier if we actually do have some data here. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull out the testimonial itself. And I'm just going to use the same thing, testimonial.name, and that should ensure that we have a good key. And then for the index, we're not actually using that yet. So I guess we won't have that on the page until we actually style that up. Let me go ahead and hit save. Now that all that's in place, let's see if we can go ahead and actually style up our testimonial to look a lot more like the design. The first thing we're going to want to do is come into our div and add a class name here. This is the wrapper for all of our testimonials. So this is what's going to have our border gradient on it. Let's go ahead and add our border gradient class and see if that adds the correct border gradient. And it looks like it does. We also want border radius. So we'll say rounded 3XL, and that should add 24 pixels of border radius. We do want there to be some padding. So we'll say PX6 to add 24 pixels of padding left and right. And then we will also say PY16, and that should add 64 pixels of padding top and bottom. I'm also going to say relative here because we do know that we're going to add our opening quote. And so I need a relative container to be able to add that absolutely positioned quote into. For the quote, let's go ahead and add a font awesome icon because that is what that is. So let's go ahead and say font awesome icon. The icon is going to be FA quote left. And as I start typing it, you can see that it's available to me from the free solid SVG icon. So I'll go ahead and select that one, and I'll go ahead and add a class name as well. We know that this is going to be absolute. So let's go ahead and add that, and then we'll see how to position it as soon as we add that in there. We need to bring down the size, so we can say size 20. That'll make it 80 by 80. And then we'll say text violet 400 to make it the right color. In order to get it positioned right, though, we need to say top 0. And then to pull it up, we can say negative translate y 1/2, and that should pull it up in the y direction. Now for the quote itself, we know that the text size is going to need to come up. So we'll say class name on our paragraph, and then we'll say text XL to bring the font size up to our 20 pixels, and font medium to change the font weight and make it a little bit heavier. We know that we are going to eventually be flexing this paragraph next to our citation, which includes our image, our name, and our title. So we can go ahead and start adding the styles for that now as well by saying class name here, and then we'll just say flex call to go ahead and flex it in the column direction. And then we can add a gap of 48 pixels to split our image from our text. For the image itself, let's go ahead and add a class name to it as well. And we want to add some border radius. So we'll say rounded XL for that. Size 28 will take care of ensuring that it's the right height and width, which it should already be. So we can move down to our name. For our name, we'll say class name equals font bold to give it the bold font weight. We also want to say MT4 to split it from the image. And we can see that this is italicized text right now. That's due to the default styling of our site tag. Let's go ahead and change that by giving that a class name as well. And we'll say not italic, and that should ensure that our text inside of that is not italic. Moving down to our title, let's give that a class name as well. That's going to be text extra small to make sure it's the right font size, text gray 400 to make sure it's the right color, and then MT2 should ensure that it's split from our name by just a couple of pixels. Right now, this is looking pretty similar to our design, but we still need to work on our dots that are below our testimonials themselves. So for this, that's going to be this div right here. So the first thing we'll do is come into our dots themselves and say class name equals size 6. We'll ensure that they're the right size. And then the little white dots themselves, we also want to add a class name on to style those as well. So we'll say size 1.5 to make them 6 by 6, and then BG gray 200 should ensure that those actually show up on the page. We'll want to say rounded full to make sure that they have the right border radius, and then we need to put those beside each other. That's going to be our outer wrapping div. So for our outer wrapping div for our dots, we'll say class name equals flex to flex those next to each other, and to spread those out a little bit more, we'll say gap 2 to give those 8 pixels of spacing in between. In order to align those to the center of the page, we'll say justify center, and we'll also want to make sure that those are split from our testimonial. However, we don't want to necessarily add margin top here because we are going to eventually flex those over to the side of the page. So we actually want to control that gap with this wrapping div. So let's come all the way up to our wrapping div that has our border gradient. And we want to say flex call for this. And then we're going to control the gap between our dots and our actual testimonials with this flexed div. And to do that, we need to also add gap 12 onto that flex div, and that should ensure that our dots go to the right spot. Now for our selected dot, we do want to style it a little bit differently because we want to make sure that it has a border like it should. Now normally we could just come in here and say border gradient and ensure that these have the border gradient that we need. However, the problem is that in the future, we are going to want to be able to change the position of our gradient border and make it look like it's sliding from one dot to the next. So we can't style it this way. We're actually going to have to add in an absolutely positioned div that just has our border and is the same size as our wrapper for our dot. So we'll say class name here, and this is going to be absolute border gradient, and we'll say size full. That should hopefully make sure it's the same size as our container. For this size 6 wrapper, we'll say relative to ensure that it's positioned relative, and that should ensure that our border gradient is sitting inside of each of our dot containers. Now for this to work, we need to do a couple of more things. We need to say rounded full to ensure that we have the 100% border radius, and we also want to make sure that our absolutely positioned content is below our dot. So we'll want to say isolate to add this isolation stacking context, and then we can just say negative Z10, and that should pull our gradient below the actual dot itself. Now we can see the dot is not in the center of our container. So in order to do that, we can just say inline flex items center justify center, and that should ensure that our dot moves to the center of our container. Of course, we only want to show this border gradient if it's our selected testimonial, not for all testimonials. So we can do that just by saying if the selected testimonial index is equal to our current testimonial index, which we can grab from our map. So we'll say index here. So if our selected testimonial index is equal to the index that we just grabbed, then we'll go ahead and say and just show that div if that is true. Now that we've done that, you can see that our border gradient is only around our first dot, which is exactly the way it should be, and it's certainly the way that it is in our design. In order to test to make sure everything is aligned, let's go ahead and take our reference image and overlay it on top of our coded section and see if we see any differences in our mobile view. And right now, I'm not seeing anything strange. I'm not seeing any blurry text. I'm not seeing anything out of alignment, which means I think we did a great job coding this section up, and it's time to move on to our tablet view. So I'm going to go ahead and take our reference image, pull it back out to our side-by-side, and scoot over to our tablet view and see what's going to change over in this particular section. Now I can already see, because my reference image is already overlaid on this section, that we don't quite have things correct here. So let me go ahead and take my reference image, pull it out to the side, and see what's different between our design and what we have in our code. And one of the first things I'm seeing is we have a little bit of extra padding or margin on the left and right of our testimonial block in our design than we have in our coded template. So in order to account for that, we can just come up to our outer wrapper div that has this border gradient on it and add a little bit of margin on the left and right. So I'm going to say medium MX10, and that should add 40 pixels of margin left and right and account for that extra space that's there. In order to check that it's still the right size, let's go ahead and overlay our design, and we can see that our border is definitely aligned with what we have in our design, which is definitely a good thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull my reference image out back to side by side and see what else we need to account for. I can also see that our text size for our actual quote is a little bit different at this size as well. So let's come into our block quote. We can see that we have this paragraph here that's containing our testimonial.quote. So to move that up, we'll say at the medium size, that's going to be text 2XL, and hopefully that should make that the right font size. I'm also seeing at this size, we do have a little bit more padding on the left and right of our testimonials themselves. So to account for that, that's going to be this div with our border gradient as well. Let me go ahead and pull my browser over a little bit and look at our padding on the left and right. That's currently px6 for 24 pixels of padding on the left and right. We're going to change that at the medium size and say px10 to make it 40 pixels of padding left and right at this screen size. And then the other thing we're definitely seeing is that our dots at this size are moved to the right of our testimonial instead of being down at the bottom. So we can account for that by simply going over in that same div and looking at what we're doing with our flex box. So right now we're flexing in the column direction at the medium size. We're going to want to change that to be flexed in the row direction, and that should ensure that our dots are moved in to side by side instead of left and right. Now we'll say items center to ensure that those are positioned in the center. And then in order to get those to show top to bottom instead of left to right, we can come down to our wrapping div that wraps around those dots and say that these are going to be at the medium sized flexed call to ensure that they show up top to bottom. Now that we've done that work, let's go ahead and see if we notice any other differences. I'm not seeing any right offhand, so let's go ahead and overlay our reference image on top of our coded section and see if we see any differences once that's overlaid as well. And right offhand, I'm not seeing any differences. Everything looks correct. So with that, let's move on to our desktop view and see if everything looks good over there as well. In order to get a good look at my desktop view, I'm going to pull out my browser window so that I can take a look at this section. So we have our desktop view that's showing this testimonial section, and we can see that over in our design now we're putting our quote to the left of our citation rather than aligning them top to bottom. So we definitely want to make sure that we account for that. I'm not seeing a lot of other differences. I am seeing looks like there's a little bit of a padding difference. So the distance between my dots on the right looks a little bit different in my design than what I'm seeing. We may also have some padding top differences. It looks like the size or the space between my top of my box and my quote is a little bit different as well. So we want to account for all of those things in our code. So coming back over into our code, let's start to account for some of those differences. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure that my testimonials are flexed in the row direction instead of the column direction. So you can see right here, my block quote that's aligning my quote next to my citation is currently flexed in the column direction. So at the large size, we're going to change that and flex that in the row direction. After that, we want to make sure that our padding is updated. So I'm going to come up to my wrapping div and ensure that up here we say at the large size my padding left and right is going to be that 64 pixels, and then my padding top and bottom is also going to increase. So at the large size we'll say py24, and that should put the 96 pixels of padding top and bottom that we saw in our design. Now, I don't mind that my name or my title wraps under my testimonial image, but of course I don't want my image to get squished. So in order to take care of that, we just need to say max width none on our image, and that should ensure that our image stays the right size and of course the right aspect ratio. As I pull out my browser again, let's see if there are any other differences that we notice right offhand. One of the things I'm definitely noticing is that the size has also been increased from the sides of our section content versus what we're seeing in our coded page as well. So we pull back my browser window again and ensure that we add some extra margin to our gradient border to ensure that it's accounting for that as well. So we'll say at the large size, we'll add a roll of MX20, and that should ensure that we add some extra spacing to the left and right of our testimonial. Now that we've done that, let me pull out my browser window one more time and go ahead and overlay my reference image on top of my content. And as I do that, I can see that we actually have some alignment issues where we're aligning left and right based on the change in screen size. So let me go ahead and change my image opacity just to the design. So the design is aligned to the right, and it looks like if I swipe over that my actual content is aligned to the left. So since that's the case, let's go ahead and take care of that by going ahead and once again pulling my reference image out to the side, pulling my browser window in a little bit and coming down into my quote and saying in this citation that we need to say at the large size, the text is going to be aligned to the right. So we'll say large text right, and hopefully that should align my testimonial citation to the right like we see in our design. Now that we've done that, let me go ahead and overlay my reference image one more time, and we can see that now it looks like things are aligned as they should be. The only difference that I'm seeing, the thing that we forgot to do in this particular section versus what I'm seeing in my design, is we don't have any border top here on the top like we do in our design, splitting this section from the last one. So we'll want to go ahead and add that border top. That's a pretty easy change. We can come up into our code, come up to our section border, and give this a border top prop. And as soon as we hit save, we should hopefully see that border top getting added up there. Now that everything looks good in this desktop view, let me go back through all of my responsive views, go ahead and overlay my design for every single one, and then go ahead and scroll up and down to ensure that everything still looks good after I've taken care of some of my responsive variants. So I'm coming back down into my mobile view, going ahead and overlaying that one as well. And we still see that everything is looking great. I am seeing a little bit of a difference here in the quote position. So let me just double check that real quick by going ahead and pulling my reference image back out to the side and looking at where my quote is aligned. And it looks like for some reason it's aligned to the center here on my mobile view. So I need to take care of that really quickly. That looks like the only thing that's really different here. And we'll just want to make sure that our left position matches the amount of padding that we have to the left of this particular div. So we can say left 6 at the mobile size. And then as we move that up, we can go to a medium size of left 10, and then ultimately at the large size, we can set this to left 16, and that should ensure that our quote is aligned in the right position at all of our responsive sizes. So let me go ahead and overlay this one more time. Take a look at our tablet view, which looks like it is also aligned, and then at the desktop size, it looks like it is aligned as well. Now that all of our responsive testimonials look good, at least statically, it's time for us to move on to the next section of the page. One thing I almost forgot to take care of is we need to remove the padding bottom 1000 pixels from our section to ensure that we don't have any problems as we move on to the next section of the page. So after that is complete, we should be able to scroll down and see that we can't scroll past our testimonials. As long as that's the case, that means that our padding bottom has been properly removed. So with that, now we can move on to our next section. Moving down below our testimonials, you can see that the next section of our page is our call to action. This is a pretty simple section, but it is going to have a neat effect when we're all done with it. We're going to have a title, a description, a call to action button, and then you can see we're going to have some orbits. We're going to have a gradient that goes from the center to the outside, and we're going to have all of these planets that are going to be placed in this section that we're going to be able to move along with the mouse once we come back and put in our section animation. So this is going to really have a neat effect after we're all done with it. But for now, we're only going to be worrying about the static design. Coming over into our tablet view, it's not going to be too much different. You're just going to see fewer planets. And of course, the gradient is going to be a little bit more subdued. And then in the mobile view, as we come down to our call to action section, at this view size, you can't see any planets. Of course, the title size has been reduced. We are still going to be using the same technique that we had to underline our spherical word that we used up in the hero. But other than that, I think it should be pretty straightforward. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the code. In order to add our call to action to the page in our code, let's come into our sections/call to action and see what is contained within this section. Right now, we're just exporting the call to action section as a JSX element. So let's go into our source/app/page and import that in there. When I come in here, I should come to the top of the file and just go ahead and import call to action from @/sections/call to action. And then I can drop this into the bottom of my page as it stands. So I'm going to say call to action here at the bottom to drop in that section component. If I've done everything properly, as I scroll down, I should see the words call to action here at the bottom. Since I do, that means everything is linked up. So I'm going to close out my page.tsx and come back into my call to action section. In here, I'm going to do something very similar to what I've done with my other sections. I'm going to go ahead and add a class name of PB with a custom value of 1000 pixels just to be able to have some padding bottom so that we can see the design next to our call to action. I'm also going to pull up my browser a little bit so that as we're coding this up, I can see the content of the section. And with that, I should be able to close out my sidebar and just concentrate on the code within this section. The first thing that we're going to do is replace our call to action text. We're going to come inside of here, add a div with a class name of container that should contain the content from the sides of the page. Let me go ahead and scroll over my browser just a little bit. Inside of that, we have a section border. So I'm going to add in that section border component that we've already created. And as soon as I hit enter, that should import that at the top of my file, which of course it does. I also want to add in my section content component that we've already created. So I should see that import automatically as well. And then inside of that is where I'm going to add the content of this section. So we're going to start with a semantic h2 tag. That's going to say join the AI revolution with Spherial. And after I hit save, I should see those words show up. Under that, we're going to have a paragraph tag. That's going to have the text experience, the transformative power of AI with Spherial. I'm just going to copy and paste that into my page. And it's also going to say boost your productivity and streamline your workflow with our innovative AI chat platform. And then below that, we're going to have our button. So that's going to be using the button component that we've already created. I should be able to hit enter and see that automatically import as well. And then inside that button, we're going to have the text get started. That should be all of the content for this section, which means now we can come back and start styling up this section, as well as adding our orbits, our gradients, anything else that we're going to need to style this section properly. Let's start with the border. I keep forgetting to add in the border until the end, but let's go ahead for right now and go ahead and add the border top prop. That should add our crosses and our border like we see up here in the top. Now let's move on to our title. Let's add a class name to our H2, and this is going to have classes of text gray 200 to reset the color to a little bit lighter. We're going to say font semi-bold to have the right font weight. It's going to be text 3XL for the right font size. And then we're also going to make sure that this is aligned towards the center with text center, as well as letting tight to bring in the letter spacing just a little bit. We know we're going to want to use the same technique that we had to underline our spherical text. So I'm going to go ahead and add a span tag around the word spherical, but we're going to come back to that here in a second after we've styled the rest of our section content. Over for our description, we're going to add a class name to it as well. And we're going to say text center to make sure it's aligned towards the center. Text extra large should make sure it's the right font size, and then MT8 should put 32 pixels of margin between this description and our title, which looks like it is equivalent to what we currently have in our design. To get our button towards the center, we'll want to use a little bit different technique. We'll wrap this in a div, and that div we'll go ahead and give a class name to as well. And we'll just go ahead and flex that and justify center. That should push our button towards the center. We'll also want to say MT10 on this wrapping div, and that should push it down by 40 pixels. And then our button variant is our secondary one. So we'll say variant equals secondary, and that should ensure that it's the white button instead of the one with the gradient border. After doing that, let's see if our content is aligned. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab my reference image, overlay it on top of my current code, and we can see that for this section, we don't have our orbits or anything in there yet, but everything else is aligned as far as our content goes. So that's a good sign. Now, before we go any further, let's go ahead and implement our underline in this span tag. So we need to import that underline image. So I'm going to import underline image from @assets/images/underline.svg. And in this case, we want to just get the source URL, not the SVG component. So I'm going to put this question mark here and say URL, and that will just tell our Webpack compiler to give us the source URL based on our current config. So now that we have that underline image, we should be able to use that to go ahead and mask our underline for our spherical text. In order to do that, we need to go ahead and wrap this in another span tag. So that's going to allow us to have a relative wrapping tag. So we'll go ahead and give this a class name of relative and isolate, because we're going to want to be able to use that stacking context. And then for our underline, we need to go ahead and give this another span tag here. And this is going to be for our underline. So we're going to say class name equals absolute. It's going to be top full to make sure it is 100% from the top, and left 0. It's going to be width full and height of 16 pixels. So we'll say H4. And then let's go ahead and just give this a BG of violet 400 for now, just to be able to see this show up. Hopefully this will show up before we go into the linear gradient. Now to change this background over to a linear gradient, we could just go ahead and give this a custom value of linear gradient. And this is going to go to the right. We're going to go from a var of color amber 300 After that, we're going to go to var color teal 300. After that, we'll have var color violet 400. And then we'll go to var color fuchsia 400. And after we hit save on that, hopefully that will show our linear gradient background if we've done everything correctly. And it looks like I forgot my ending parentheses at the end of this, so I need to add one more parentheses in there, and that should make sure that my gradient shows up under my spheral text. Even though I've done that, it looks like I misspelled this variable here, and that's probably causing my entire linear gradient not to work. So this should be fuchsia, and that should make sure that we are actually using the variable that we have defined. Now that we have that linear gradient, now we just need to mask it based on the underlying image that we brought in. So after I save that, I can come over here and go ahead and add a style to this span. So we can say style equals, and then we can say mask image, and that's going to be a URL of our underline image.source. And let's see if that does mask it. It does, but of course we want to make sure that it's contained within the div that we've defined. So we need to say mask size, and then we can say contain, and that should contain that within our absolute position div. Now, in order to position this correctly, we need to say mask position, and we'll position that to the center, and then we can say mask repeat, and we can say no repeat, and that should ensure that it's just showing in the center without repeating. Now, it looks like we don't actually want this to be in the center. It looks like we want this to be in the at the top. So we'll say mask position top, and we'll see if that allows us to push that up towards the top. Now, it still looks like our underline is a little bit lower than I'm seeing in our design, and it looks like that's because we need to pull this up by 8 pixels. So in order to do that, what we need to do is just say negative translate y 1/2, and that should pull that up by those 8 pixels and actually put that where we're seeing this in our design. Now that we've done that, let's just ensure that it is showing up in exactly the right spot. So I'm going to overlay my reference image one more time and go ahead and scroll up and down a little bit just to be able to align things. And it does look like it's in exactly the right spot. So I can pull my reference image out back to the side and continue styling up this section. The next thing I think I'd like to do is go ahead and add my orbits in here. So for our section content, we can say class name of relative. That will give us a spot to be able to add in an absolute position div. And we're just going to go ahead and do that right here. So I'm going to say div class name equals absolute, and that'll be the absolute position div that wraps our orbits. We'll also make it the same size as our section content by saying inset 0, and that should ensure that it aligns to the top, left, bottom, and right of that particular section. Now that we've done that, let's bring in our orbit, which we should have already created as a component. So I'll just go ahead and use my orbit here. And to make it the right size, we'll give this a class name as well. And this first one is going to be a size of a custom value of 200 pixels. As soon as I give that the self-closing tag, we should see that that shows up to the top left of our absolute position div. So we need to make sure that this is in the center. And to do that, we should just be able to use the absolute center utility that we had created earlier. Now that we've created our first orbit, let's go ahead and create our other one. So there's 5 total orbits for this section. So we'll go ahead and copy and paste that and make those 5 orbits, and then we can just change the size of this. So the next one up is going to be our 350 pixels. The next one up is going to be 500 pixels. Above that is going to be 650 pixels, and the next one, the very biggest one, is going to be 800 pixels. So as soon as I save that, we should see that our orbits are showing up in the right spot. And they do look like they are. Looks like everything looks good there. So with that, let's go ahead and see if we can also add on our gradient below these orbits. So for our gradient, we'll come below our absolute position div and go ahead and add another div with a class name of absolute inset 0. That's going to make sure that it's the same size as our relative container. And we'll just go ahead and give this a self-closing tag for now, because this is just going to be one div that we need to add here. We need to add in a custom background. So this custom background is going to be a radial gradient, much like we did for our hero. So we're going to say BG, and then we'll say radial gradient. And that's going to be a circle to the farthest corner. And it's going to go from var color fuchsia 900 to at 50% to var dash dash color indigo 900 at 75%. And then from there, it's just going to go to transparent. After we save that, we do see that our background gradient is showing up, but there are a couple things wrong. And the first one is the fact that we don't want the entire thing to show with that much intensity. And so in order to get this to be a little bit less intense, we're going to use a mask image in order to just show it as most intense in the center and then going down from there. So we can just say mask image, and that can be a radial gradient as well. That's also going to be shaped as a circle to the farthest side, and I'm going to go from black to transparent. When we save that, that should give that nice fade out effect where we go from intense in the center, but as we go towards the edges, then it starts to fade out to transparent. Now, what I'm noticing here is that we have a relative container with some absolute position div, but these absolute position divs are sitting on top of our content. We don't want that, so we can use the isolate class to add this stacking context isolation, and then we can say negative Z10 for both of our absolute position divs, and that should just pull it down below our content and ensure that our content is showing on top of everything else. Now that we've got all that in place, that should be everything that we need for our mobile view. Since we aren't seeing any planets yet, we'll put those in place after we get to those particular sections. So let me go ahead and overlay my reference image one more time on top of my coded section and see if anything looks different. And that's all looking the same. It's all looking great, which means we can move on to some of our responsive views. Moving over to our tablet section, we know there's going to be a couple of changes over here in this responsive view, and it looks like the main one is going to be the font size as well as seeing our planets show up for the first time. So we need to start implementing those planets in this section. So let me go ahead and pull out my reference image over to side by side, and then first take care of our font size. Right now it's text 3XL. At the medium size, we're going to move this up to text 4XL, and that should ensure that the font size changes according to what we see in our design. So just to ensure that that content is showing up correctly, let me go ahead and overlay my reference image one more time, and we do see that everything looks like it's showing up nicely. So let's go ahead and pull that back out and account for our planets in this section. The way that I think will be easiest to implement this is going to be to come into our section content and add another div, and that div is going to position all of our planets towards the center. So we'll go ahead and give this a class name of absolute center, and we'll also pull this down below our content by saying negative Z10. So it'll be above our orbits, but still below our content. Inside of that, we'll use our planet component that we should have already created. So as soon as I hit enter, that should get imported at the top of my file. And then we can start to add on some of the props that should allow us to style our planet component properly. So we'll say size equals large for these particular ones. We'll say color equals violet. And then we'll also give this a class name to be able to set the translation of our planet. And it looks like this should either be small, medium, or large, but an abbreviated size for that. So I'll just say LG for that. Thank you, Typescript, for showing me where I went wrong there. Now this planet, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image once again. This planet is going to be this one down here to the left. So we're going to want to translate this. So I'm going to say translate Y 200 pixels, and that should push that down by 200 pixels. And then if we can bring that over to the left by saying negative translate X 200 pixels as well, and that should put that on top of the planet that we see in our design. And then to rotate this, we just need to say rotate 45, and that should ensure that it's rotated towards the center so that it looks like the light is shining from the center towards our planet. To add our next planet, we'll go ahead and just kind of copy and paste what we have here. We want it to also be pushed towards the center with our wrapping div, and then we'll allow the planet to translate to be in the right positions. We know that it's not going to be in the same position, so we can take these classes off, but it is going to be a large violet planet, so we can go ahead and keep those other props in place. This one's going to be exactly opposite of what we have for our other planet. So this one's going to be translated in the X direction by 200 pixels to the right. And we can do that with translate X with a custom value of 200 pixels. And then we can move it up with negative translate Y 200 pixels. And let's see if that puts it in the right spot or not. It does look like it does. And what I'm seeing here is essentially our rotate 45 is rotating it in exactly the wrong direction. So we need to actually pull this out and say negative rotate 135, and that should hopefully point it towards the center of our section. So after we've done that, we see that it looks like it's correct. So everything in this section at the tablet view right now with our reference image overlaid looks correct. So I think this one is looking good. Let's go move on to our large size and see what else we need to do in order to get this to look right as well. Now for our large size screen, I believe our reference image might have a bit too much opacity. So let's pull that down. And we can see after we pull that down that we do definitely have some differences with our large size screen. It looks like the main difference is going to be the size of the title text, as well as we need to put the description inside of a container and maybe change the size of that as well. So we'll see after we get this in place. So let me go ahead and pull out my reference image to the side. Let me go ahead and say side by side instead of overlaid. And then we'll go ahead and start changing our different font sizes and see if we can get this to look correct. Coming down to my title, it is currently text 4XL. So at the large size, we'll switch this to text 5XL to just bump that up a bit. And let's see what that looks like after we make that shift. Now that font size looks right, but we're not constraining this inside of any container. So let's see if we can also do that by saying max width 3XL, and let's see if that is a small enough container to get that to be constrained properly. It does look like it is, so let me say MX Auto as well, and that should push that back towards the center, and it brings down that spherical text, which is exactly what we want. For our description, we'll need to also constrain the size of that, so we'll say max width 2XL here. Let's see if that's the right size. And that brings down the word platform, which is exactly what I see on my design as well. So let's say MX Auto here, and that should also push that description more towards the center as well. Now that we've made those changes, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image once again and see if everything is aligned. Let me go ahead and scrub back and forth. And it looks like everything is good except for our planets at this point. So that means we can just go ahead and put in our planets, and we should be able to then get this to look exactly like the design. So we know our planets are up top. Let's go ahead and put in a couple more planets. So we'll go ahead and handle the teal ones next. So I'm going to just simply copy and paste a couple more times what we have for our violet planets, except we're going to change these to a medium size, and the color is going to be teal. So we'll say medium teal for both of those. And then we'll also take off the translations because we know that the translations are going to change for these planets. So I can see my planets aligning towards the center. So let's go ahead and handle this one on the left first. And it looks like for that one, let's go ahead and negatively translate this one in the X direction by a custom value of 500 pixels. And let's see if that's aligned on top of our planet. It looks like it is, but the rotation is going to be the problem here. So we want to rotate this by 90 degrees to get it to look like it's facing towards the center. Now that we've handled that planet, we need to handle our second teal planet over here to the right. So in order to do that, we'll say translate X with a custom value of 500 pixels as well. So it's opposite of what our left planet is, but it's also a little higher than our other planets. We'll say negative translate Y in a custom value of 100 pixels, and that should pull that up. Now, I think the negative 135 value is still what we need for our rotation, so that one looks like it's actually already correct. Now that we have our teal planets in place, then we just need to handle our fuchsia planets. Those are going to be the small ones that we see to the left and right as well. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste my last planet. Go ahead and take out my translation values because I know that those are going to be changing. So I'm just going to cut those out. And then for each of these planets, we also want to say that it is small and fuchsia. So we'll go ahead and add those values to the props. So the second one here is small and fuchsia as well. After I hit enter, you can barely see them, but there is a fuchsia planet showing up there in the center. So we need to pull the first one out. We're going to handle this one to the top left here first. So I'm going to say negative translate in the X direction by a custom value of 400 pixels. And then to bring it up, we'll say negative translate in the Y direction by a custom value of 250 pixels. And then to change our rotation value, that's going to be a rotation value of 135. So we'll say rotate 135, and that should point that directly towards the center. And then for our other small fuchsia planet, we're still faintly seeing the second one showing up here. We just need to get the translation to the right spot. So we'll say translate X 400 pixels. And then we'll say translate Y 150 pixels to move that down by 150 pixels from the center. And now we can see that that's correct. I think the negative rotate 135 is correct. Let me just go ahead and double check on that. Or excuse me, that should be a negative rotate of 45. So we'll just go ahead and change that. That should point that more towards the center. So now that our planets are in place, I think everything should be in place. We have this reference image overlaid right now, so we can see that everything is aligned at this large size. But let's go ahead and just give one more look to our other screen sizes to ensure we didn't mess anything up on those as we were creating a responsive style. So I'm going to overlay my mobile reference image on top as well. And I'm seeing everything looks like it's aligned. So for our static section, for this call to action, it looks like so far so good. Let me go ahead and do one more thing. Come up to the top, take off our class name that adds some padding bottom at the bottom of this. And that should mean that after that's done, we should just be able to scroll down to the bottom of our call to action and no further. Now that that's all taken care of, let's move on to the next section of the page. Coming back into our design, the last part of this page is going to be this footer. So you can see that we have a very simple Serial.ai logo text here. We have some navigation on the right, copyright, and we have a couple of social icons. So nothing too crazy on the desktop view. Let's see what our responsive views look like as well. So after we come over into the tablet view, we start to put our Serial.ai logo text on top of our navigation, but our copyright and our social icons still say justified between. And then in the mobile view, then we're going to be stacking everything. So you can see that our social icons are going to stack on top of our copyright, and we're also going to be stacking our navigation top to bottom as well. So we can account for all of that in our code. Of course, we're going to do that. Let's go ahead and head back over to our code. In order to get started creating our footer, let's come into our source directory, come into our sections, and we should see a footer.tsx file all ready for us to go. You can see that for this, we have a nav items array that has our navigation, and we also have our social links array that has each of our icons already pre-created for us to be able to drop into our footer. And then below that, you should see the footer component that just returns a semantic footer tag with the words footer section. Since that's there, we need to come into our app and come into our page.tsx. And then in order to drop our footer in, we'll say import footer from @/sections/footer. And then after we've done that, we should be able to drop that into the bottom of our page just by adding our footer component with a self-closing tag to the bottom. When we've done that, let me go ahead and pull my reference image out to side by side so we're not seeing that overlaid anymore. And if I scroll down, I should see the words footer section. Since we do see that, that means that our section is properly integrated into our page. So I'll go ahead and close out my page.tsx, and then we can concentrate on our footer.tsx file. I can also close out my sidebar just to give our code a little bit more room, and then we can come inside of our footer section and start creating our content for this section. The first thing I'm going to do is remove my footer section text and come in here and say class name equals with a custom value of padding bottom 1000 pixels, just to be able to see our design as we're working with it. And as we save that and scroll down, we should be able to see that now we do have the footer showing up here to the right. And I'm going to pull out my browser window just a little bit to be able to see both our design and our code as we continue to work on this section. Inside of this section, the first thing that we're going to create is our container. So I'm going to say div class name equals container, and that should push our section content out from the side. Now in this particular section, we actually don't have a border, although we do have some section content. I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to use either of those. So for now, I'm just going to leave those out, and we're going to start with the actual content itself. So for the top content, we know that we have a div, and then inside of that, we probably have a div for the Serial.ai text. So I'm going to say Serial, if I can spell that right, .ai, and that should put the text there at the top. And then for that navigation, we can just go ahead and create a semantic nav tag and then put the navigation items inside that. We know that we have this nav items array, so I can just go ahead and start creating those by saying nav items.map, and then we'll have an item that will then output some JSX for each of those items. That's going to be a link, so we'll have an href for those. That's going to be item.href. And then for the actual text, that's going to be item.name. We also need a key to keep React happy. So I'm going to say key equals item.key href. It could have been either one, but we'll just go with the href for now. And after I hit save, I do see that each of those nav items are showing up. They're unstyled, but that's fine for now. We can style them up here in a second. For our bottom content, we're going to have our social links and we're going to have our copyright text. So I'm going to go ahead and create a div for that. The social links are going to come on top. So I'm going to create a div to wrap those. And then for each of our social links, we'll just say social links.map and we'll say link. And then that for each of those links, we're going to show some JSX as well. And that's just going to be a div. Now this one's going to be a little bit different because we're bringing in an icon. So I'm going to drop in my font awesome icon. And then we're going to say icon equals whatever our social links array tells us it should be. So this should be icon equals link.icon. And then we'll just go ahead and give that a self-closing tag. Each of these divs should have a key as well. So we'll say that the key is going to be link.name, and that should ensure that each of those has a unique name. After I save that, I can see that my icons are there. They're way too big right now, but that's fine. We're just dropping the content on. We'll come back and style this here in 1 second. Now we just need to go ahead and drop on our copyright text below this div. So we'll come below this div, go ahead and create a semantic paragraph tag and just say, and copy, front end tribe, all rights reserved. And I will need to capitalize all just because they're like that in my design. I don't want anything to mess up my ability to create this in a pixel perfect way. Now that we have the content on the page, now it's time to style this up. So for this footer, we are going to add a border on the top. So we can say border T for border top, and then we can say border, and then go ahead and give it the custom value of var color border. And after we save that, we should see a border showing across the top of our footer, just like it is in the design. Inside of our container, we can just go ahead and add some classes on here to handle the padding. So we can say py8 on that container as well. And that should ensure that we have some padding between our content and the edge of our container. To style up our spheral.ai logo text, we'll go ahead and give this a class name, and we'll say that it is font extra bold, as well as text 2XL, and that should make it the right size. We'll want to push this towards the center. We can probably do that with this flexed container though, so I'm going to go ahead and handle that with the wrapping div. So we can give this wrapping div a class name, and we'll say flex. We can say flex call to ensure that we're flexing in the Y direction, and then we can say items center, and that should push our items towards the center of the page, and we can see that indeed it does. For our navigation, let's go ahead and add some classes to this as well. So we know that this is going to be at the mobile size flexed in the column direction as well. So we'll say flex call. We want to give this a gap. So we'll say gap 8, and that should make sure that they're spaced out. We'll want to say items center to ensure that they are pushed towards the center of the page. And then everything else is going to be the actual text style. So let's go ahead and add a class onto our A tag, and that should enable us to add some text style. So we'll say uppercase to make sure that they're uppercase. We'll say text extra small to set the font size. We'll go ahead and give those some letter spacing with tracking widest. We'll say font bold to set the font weight correctly. We'll make them the right color with text gray 400 just to make them a little darker than our default text gray 300. And that is all looking right. Now we just need to have some space in between our spheral.ai logo text and our navigation. We can do this with this flex container right here. So we can just say gap 8, and hopefully that should add the right spacing in between our logo text and our navigation. Moving down to our social links, let's go ahead and take care of the styles for these as well. The first thing I'd like to do is bring down the size of these icons. So let me go ahead and add a class name onto my font awesome icon, and we'll say size 4 to make those 16 by 16. And then to fill those with the right color, we'll say text gray 500, and hopefully that should make those the right color. It does look like the color that we're actually using for these icons might be the 300, so I'm actually going to remove this text gray 500 and let those be the normal brighter color. Now to get these to be aligned left to right instead of top to bottom, let's go ahead and take this div and flex that as well. So the wrapping div is going to have a class name of flex to get those to flex in the row direction. Justify center should ensure that each of these social links is centered properly. And then to add the space in between, we can say gap 6, and that will add 24 pixels of space in between each of these icons. For the links themselves, we also need to add a class name around here because we have a wrapper around each of these icons as well. So we'll say size 10 to make that 40 by 40, rounded full will make sure that has a border radius of 100%, and BG gray 900 should ensure that it's the right color. To move our social icons towards the center, we can just go ahead and inline flex this. So we can say inline flex items, center, justify, center, and that should push those social icons towards the center of each of our wrapping divs. Now that those are in place, we do see that inside of our social links, we do have an href that we haven't accounted for yet. I actually am not going to really account for this other than wrapping this in an A tag. So what I'm going to do is just remove any kind of href other than the simple hash symbol, and then we'll just go ahead and wrap each of these social links inside an A tag with an href of link.href, and that should at least account for them being able to have a link available to each of these social links. And then to make React happy, we'll just go ahead and move our key up into our link as well. That shouldn't change any positioning. All that should do is ensure that if we click on one, it should take us, well, really nowhere. But if you wanted to add some of your own links, you certainly could. Now to move those links apart from our navigation, let's go ahead and in the wrapping div, go ahead and add a class name here. And we'll say MT16, and hopefully that should move that down by the right amount. And then we can also use this as our flex container as well. So we'll say flex call to make sure that we're flexed in the column direction. And then items center should push our content towards the center of the page. We can also add a gap on this div. So we can say gap 8, and that should push the content of our copyright down by the right amount as well. For the copyright itself, let's go ahead and add a class name here as well. And we'll say text gray 500 to darken that, as well as text small to make it the right font size. Now that we've done all that, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image on top of our code and see if we have any problems after we scroll up and down a little bit to see if we are aligned with our design. And it looks like the design is perfectly aligned. We're not seeing any differences. So that means that our mobile view is done for the footer. Let's go ahead and move on to our other views and see what those look like as well. Over in our tablet view, let me pull out my browser window just a little bit to get a better look. And let me go ahead and put my reference image over to side by side instead of overlaid. And we should see that we currently have this stacked top to bottom. But in our tablet view, we're going ahead and justifying our copyright text beside our social icons, and we're pulling out our nav so that it is aligned left to right. So we'll have to make both of those changes, starting with our navigation. For our navigation, we can come into our nav, and at the medium size, we're not going to want to flex this call anymore. We're going to flex row. So we'll say medium flex row, and that should ensure that our navigation items after we save show up left to right. It does look like the gap is a little bit different at this medium size. So we'll have a medium modifier, and we'll say gap 16 to ensure that those show up with a little bit more gap in this medium size as well. After that, we want to ensure that our social icons and our copyright text are also showing up justified between. So we'll come to our wrapping div that wraps both of those. That's going to be this div right here. And then we'll say at the medium size, flex row, and also at the medium size, we'll say justify between. After we hit save, we should see that it's justified between, but it's actually backwards. We can see that at the medium size, it's pushing our social icons to the left and our copyright text to the right. Instead of, in our design, we have the copyright text to the left and our social icons to the right. The reason this is happening is because right now we have flex direction row instead of reversing that row. So because this is reversed at the tablet size, instead of flex row, we need to say medium flex row reverse, and that should add the flex direction of row reverse. That'll just reverse the direction of our items at the medium size to ensure that even though our copyright text is on the bottom, it's actually going to go to the left and our social logos will go to the right. Now that that's all in place, let's go ahead and pull out our browser window again and take a look at our overlaid design. So let me go ahead and switch to overlaid and scroll up and down a little bit to make sure everything is aligned. And it looks like everything is pixel perfect in the footer so far in the tablet view. So I like what's going on in here. Let's go over to our desktop or laptop view and see how things look over here. So I need to pull my reference image out to side by side and take a look at what the differences are. So we can see that our logo text is now going to the left and our navigation is going to the right. I don't think there's any changes to our copyright text or our social icons, so we can leave those as is. Let's come into our code. I'm going to give a little bit more room for my code to breathe. And then we're going to come into our top flexed container and see what we need to do to change this to push our logo text to the left and our navigation to the right. It's currently flexed in the column direction. So if we change this to add a large modifier with flex row, that should enable our flex container to flex in the row direction. But of course, we also need to justify this with a value of space between. So we'll say large justify between, and that should ensure we say justify content space between at this large size. So after I do that, it looks like everything's aligned, at least from what I can see. So let's go ahead and pull my browser out one more time and pull my reference image to overlaid and see if there are any differences. I'm not seeing any differences right off the bat. It looks like this is good. So let me look at all of my responsive views and see if I've messed anything up in those views as well. Those are all looking good. Let me overlay my mobile image on top of my mobile code. That section is looking great. So it looks like we didn't need our section content component for this particular section. And as a final touch, of course, we're going to come back and ensure that our padding bottom class isn't added so that we're not messing that up. Now, as I scroll up and down, I can see that my entire page is now complete and it's looking great. We don't yet have any kind of animation, but everything is looking really good throughout the page. I think the last thing that I want to do in my footer section is go ahead and hook up the navigation so that it works. In order to hook up our navigation, the first thing we need to do is ensure that we actually have these IDs in place on our page, since this is a single page that we're building. So we need to ensure that we have our features, our pricing, and our testimonials. Now, our login is not going to go anywhere, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove that particular href, but these other ones we do have on the page and we can definitely scroll to them. So what I want to do is I'm going to pull out my code a little bit, come into each of my sections and ensure that we have the IDs for each of these sections. So I'm going to come into my features section, and on the wrapper section, I'm just going to say ID equals features, and that should ensure that that ID is in place. And then I'm going to go ahead and close that down. The same thing is going to be true for pricing. We're going to come into our pricing section, come to our section tag and say ID equals pricing, and that will ensure that our ID is in place for that one. And then the same should be true for our testimonials. So I'm just going to copy this testimonials ID, come into my testimonials section and add the ID of testimonials. After all of those IDs are in place, that should ensure that we can actually go to those different sections just by clicking on our nav link. So we can try this by coming over here and clicking on features, and it should take us up to our features section, which it does. But we don't want that to happen instantly. We'd like that to happen with a smooth scroll behavior. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take off my reference image. We actually don't need this anymore. So I'm going to reset my reference image and just leave this as my actual mobile code. And then I'm going to come to my nav items and go ahead and give this an on-click handler. Now, on-click, what I would like to do is run a simple function that looks for the ID of my element. So inside that function, I'm going to say const element, and we're going to get our element by saying document.querySelector, and we'll pass it the item.href. So that should ensure that if that href is on the page, we should get back an element. Now, if we have that element, so we'll say if element, then we'll run an element.scroll into view. So we'll say element.scroll into view, and we'll say that the behavior on that is going to be smooth. After we save that, we do see that we have an error, and that's basically because this is some client-side JavaScript that we're adding to each of these links. So in order to prevent that error, we can come to the top of our file and say this is currently a client component. So we can say use client, and that should convert that to a client component and get that runtime error to go away. Now that it looks like that error is gone, let me scroll back down and see if this works. So I'm going to go to features, and it looks like we're still instantly going to that particular section. And that's because we're not preventing the default action from happening for this on click. So what I need to do is say that we're going to pass this the event, and then inside of our function, we can say e.pricing
prevent default. So that's just going to prevent the default action from happening and allow us to take over that action with some JavaScript. So I'm going to save that one more time, come back down to my footer and see if our navigation now smoothly scrolls up to our features section after we scroll all the way down. So let me click features again, and now we can see we do have a smooth scroll that is happening. So that's working really well. Let's try this with another section. We'll go to pricing, and we can see that even though we'd like to be scrolling to the top of each section, it's not necessarily doing that right now. So if we take another look, if we go to say testimonials, it's not scrolling to the top of that section. That's really just because we have the browser scroll linked together. And what I mean by that is that right now, if I scroll in my mobile view, you can see that it also scrolls in all of my other views. So it's actually messing with a little bit this scroll into view functionality that we're trying to create. So in order to turn that off in this browser, all I'm going to do is disable this synchronized scrolling, and that should enable this to work properly. So I'm going to click pricing again. And as you can see, now it goes to the top of my pricing section. Let me just verify that by clicking on features, and it also goes to the top of my features section as well. So that looks like that's working well. We now have the ability to scroll smoothly to any of the different sections within our navigation. And of course, we're just leaving out the login for now. Now that we've implemented this for the footer, we should probably go ahead and implement this for our navigation as well. So if we go all the way to the top in our header, we can see that we have the same features, pricing, and testimonials. Wouldn't it be great if we could also implement this same functionality where it would close out that and then go ahead and smooth scroll to that div as well? So I'm going to open up the header.tsx, and we already have our href available to us in all of these nav items. So let's see what we can change in order to make this work. As I'm looking through the header, you can see that we have nav items. These are the desktop view nav items. And then down here at the bottom where we see is mobile nav open, this is going to be where our mobile navigation resides. So these are the first ones that we're going to want to address. And then we can move on and also address the desktop nav items. Let's go ahead and add an on-click handler to our A tag. That's going to take in an event, and then we're going to run a function. The first thing we're going to do is prevent the default action. So we're going to say e.prevent default. That should ensure that if we click that, it's not going to go directly to that section in a jarring way. Then we can also get our element in very much the same way we did before. So we can say const element is equal to document.query selector, and we can query by the href. And if that element exists on the page, which we're just checking to ensure that we don't have any JavaScript errors, then we can scroll to it by using the element.scroll into view function. And of course, we're going to also say behavior is going to be smooth. Now, there's one other thing we need to do when we click our mobile navigation items, and that's going to be to close the mobile nav, because if we don't do that as well, then we will be able to go to that particular section, but we're still going to have the nav overlaid. So we also need to grab our set is mobile nav open, come down into our click handler, and we'll go ahead and say if element, then we'll go ahead and go to it. We'll set is mobile nav open to false, and then we'll go ahead and scroll that element into view. So let's go ahead and try that. Let me go ahead and open my mobile nav now that my page has refreshed, and go to features, and you can see that it closes the mobile nav and it scrolls to that feature section. The same thing is going to be true for testimonials. Let me go ahead and close that and scroll to testimonials. So you can see that that is working well. Now let's go ahead and apply the same functionality to our desktop navigation. So that's going to be this link right here. So we can say the same thing. We'll have an on-click handler. It's going to run a function that's going to pass in an event. We'll prevent default for that function, and then we'll find our element by saying const element equals document.query selector, and we'll grab that href if the element is on the page. Then we are going to say element.scroll into view with the behavior of smooth. And after we've saved that, we can go ahead and test that by just going over to our desktop view and then just go ahead and clicking on one of the items, and you can see that it does do the same thing. So that means we have our navigation hooked up, and not only does it work, but it has a smooth behavior. So this is working well. Let me go ahead and pull out my browser and check on the tablet view as well
to ensure that we have everything working as intended. So I'm going to go ahead and open my mobile navigation. Actually, I need to remove my reference image because we don't need that anymore. Then I'll open my mobile navigation and see what happens when I click on pricing. And you can see that it closes that mobile nav and it scrolls to that section. So we have our mobile navigation working. We have our footer navigation working. Now it's time to move on to animating some of the elements on the page. Now that we've gotten all the way through our page, let's start to take the page section by section and add animations to really bring this page to life. So for our hero section, let's talk about some of the different types of animations we'd like to add. The first one we'd like to do is we'd like to take these planets and make them move a little bit as the mouse moves around the page. So as my mouse moves, what I'd like to do is just see the planets kind of move along with it. That'll just kind of add a nice effect that will catch someone's eye as they're looking at this hero section. The other thing we'd like to do is we'd like to make these boxes on either side of our main hero image move in parallax with the scroll. So we'll talk about how to do that. And then there's just going to be a little eye-catching effect down here. We're going to make this loader animate. We're going to make this cursor blink to just bring this section alive a little bit more. So those are the things that we're going to tackle in this section. We're going to start with the easiest of those. We'll probably start with animating this down here, this little AI is generating piece, and then we'll move on to making these boxes parallax here on the sides of our hero image, and then we'll move on to making these planets move along with the mouse position. So I'm going to take my desktop zoom size down to about 80% just to give myself a little bit more room to see the entire desktop as I'm working. And then I'm going to bring my browser window over just to give my code some more room as we work. So let me go ahead and I'm going to focus down here, and let's open up our source/sections/hero and see what changes we need to make to this code in order to start to make some of these things work. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and change this SVG to the animated version. Actually, there's both versions are included, so we can just simply change out our loader from assets/images/loader to loader-animated.svg. And as soon as we save that, we should hopefully see our loader start to animate on the page. And you can actually see that, yes, we now have an animated loader on our page. And in case you can't see that, I know it's a little bit small. Let me zoom back in for a second, just so you can see what that looks like. The second thing we want to do is we'd like our cursor to be blinking here. So I'm going to scroll down to where our cursor is at. So that's after our planets. Looks like it's also after both of our chat boxes. And right here, we see that we have AI is generating, and then we have this span tag. Well, we can animate this span tag by adding a Tailwind class to it. Let me show you what I've already added to our Tailwind config to ensure that we can make this work. So if we go into our Tailwind config and we scroll down, you can see that we have some custom keyframes and we have a custom animation. So the custom keyframes is this cursor blink. What it's doing is it's saying at 0%, the opacity is 1, at 50%, it goes to 0, and at 100%, it goes to 1 again. Now, this would be a smooth animation, except for the fact that when I actually implemented the animation, I told it to use step start. And essentially what step start does is it takes the value at the start of each step and instantly transitions to it, rather than having a smooth transition between 1, 0, and 1. So it makes more of that blinking effect rather than it looking like it's animating slowly in and out of the page. So now we can use this animation by using our animate cursor blink class that we've created just by essentially having this Tailwind config animation here. So let me come back to my hero.tsx. I'll close that out for a second, and we'll go ahead and add a class name to this span. Say class name equals animate cursor blink. And you can see it automatically fills that in. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then we can see what that blink looks like when it reloads. So yes, you can see that it is just going ahead and blinking on and off the page. And I like that effect. Now that we have both of those done, let's go ahead and come to the top of our section, because now we are going to be animating these chat bubbles or creating a parallax effect with them. In order to do that, we need to do a couple of things. And the first one is going to be, we're going to be importing Framer Motion, which means we're going to turn this into a client component. So I'm going to say use client here up at the top, and then I'm going to start importing Framer Motion by saying import motion from Framer Motion. We're also going to be importing a special hook that Framer Motion provides called use scroll. That will allow us to be able to use the scroll position to change the position of things on the page, which is of course exactly what we want to do. In order to implement that though, we need to say what we want to track the scroll position of. In this case, we want to track the scroll position of our section. But in order to do that, we need to get the ref of the section, which is just a reference to the DOM element. And we can do that with React. So I'm going to say const section ref is equal to use ref, and that's going to be coming from React. And we can give that a default value of null. Now, after we've created that ref, we need to attach it somewhere in our component. And of course, we're going to attach it to this section tag. So I'm going to say ref equals section ref, and that attaches that particular ref to this section tag. So it gives us a direct way to access the DOM element of that section tag when it's rendered by React. Now that we have both of those things in place, now we can use our scroll position hook. So I'm going to say use scroll, and this is a hook that takes a target, which is of course going to be our section ref. So we're going to be tracking the scroll position of that. And then we're going to give it an offset. And what this offset is going to do is it's essentially going to define where the target and the container or the window meet. So it's kind of hard to understand with the hero. So let's take the next section for an example for this. Let's say we defined our offset as end start and start end. Essentially, this is saying that as the end of the window reaches the start of the container. So if we're taking our features section, this is about that point, just right where we see this line is where the end of the window reaches the start of the container until we scroll down and the start of the window here at the top reaches the end of the container. So we're essentially tracking the position all the way from here, if we were tracking the feature section, all the way through here. And that's going to give us a scroll Y progress value from 0 to 1. So essentially we're doing the same thing on the hero section. It's just that we can't scroll all the way up to where this would meet the end of the window. However, we will get obviously to the point where it's going to reach the end as we continue to scroll down. So we can use the scroll Y progress value from this use scroll hook. So I'm going to say const scroll Y progress, I believe, equals use scroll. And we know that that value is going to go between 0 and 1. So we want to transform that to a value that's going to allow us to actually see a transition with our chat bubbles. So we'd like to see this transition probably from something like -200 to +200. So we'd like to see it kind of scroll down the page at a different rate than the scroll itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to use another hook from Framer Motion called use transform. So we're going to say use transform. And we're going to be tracking that scroll Y progress value. And as it goes from 0 to 1, we're going to want to go from 200 to -200. So essentially scrolling a little bit faster than the actual scroll itself. And we need to then give that a variable to be able to then implement that in our page. So we'll say const transformed Y, and that's going to be equal to that use transform. Now let's make sure that use transform is brought into the page from Framer Motion. And now we have this transformed Y value that we can then use to transform these chat bubbles as we scroll. So let's go ahead and implement that by scrolling down to our chat bubbles, and let's see if we can make this happen. So as I'm looking at my chat bubble code, let me actually go ahead and toggle the word wrap so we can see this a little bit better. As I'm looking at my chat bubble code, I can see that we are already transforming this div right here. So I want to leave that one alone, but I think we can transform this one right here just by turning it into a motion.div. So I'm going to say motion.div here. I'm going to say ending motion.div here. And after I do that, then I can start to add on specific styles from my motion value. So I can say style equals, and we can just set the Y value to our transformed Y. And this is going to be for this left chat bubble here. So let's see what happens when we save this and then we scroll down the page. So we can see that, yes, it kind of follows the scroll as we scroll. So you can see it starts from about the top of the robot's ear or so. And then as we scroll down, you can see that it kind of continues to scroll down with the scroll until it's eventually about at the bottom of his left ear here. So that is working well on the left side. We can actually use the same effect to go ahead and add the right side as well. So we can come down to the same div on the right side and say motion.div for that one, ending motion.div as well. And then we can say the same thing, style equals y, and then we can say transformed y as the value, and that will transform that y value as we scroll down. So the same thing is going to happen. It's going to start from about the middle of his ear, and then after we scroll all the way down, it's going to continue to kind of follow that scroll and be in the screen a little bit longer than it would have otherwise been in. So it creates a nice little parallax effect as we're scrolling over this section, just to be able to catch the eye of the user. Now for our third animation, this one's definitely going to be a little bit more difficult because essentially what we're going to want to do, so let me go ahead and zoom this out a little bit again so that we can see this. Essentially what we're going to want to do is track the mouse position as we hover over the page, and we're going to want to move these planets in relation to the mouse position. Now, Framer Motion does not provide us a default way to get the mouse position and then to track it over a window. So we're going to need to build that ourselves, and then we can implement it with our planets. So what we want to do here is we want to come up to the top of our hero section. We're going to start to build out some of the functionality to track our mouse position. Now we are going to want to build this in a reusable way because we're also going to do the same thing in the call to action because it has planets as well. So we'd like to be able to port over this functionality down there as well. So we're going to put this actually outside of our hero component. We're going to create a custom hook here called const use mouse position. So what this is going to be is it's going to be a function that basically allows us to get the current mouse position in relation to the window. So essentially, as we go from a mouse position over here to over at the right side of the screen, we're going to want to transition the X value from 0 to 1. And as we go from the top to bottom, we're going to want to transition a Y value from 0 to 1. So essentially, we're just going to try and get the X and Y coordinates as if this were just going from a value of the left side of the screen being 0 and the right side of the screen being 1. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to need a couple of things. One of the things we're going to need is the actual size of the window itself. So we can save that with state by saying const inner width and then set inner width equals use state. And for now, we'll just use a default value of 1 for 1 pixel. And let's make sure we actually have use state in on the page by going ahead and hitting enter after I see use state pop up. The same thing is going to be true for the heights. We're going to want to save that as state as well. So I'm going to say const inner height and set inner height equals use state. And once again, we'll use a default value of 1. And then we want to track that value with a use effect. So what we'll do is we'll say use effect, and that's going to be a function that runs, and we're going to set the inner width to window.innerWidth. And we're also going to set the inner height to window.innerHeight. Now this will, and we're also going to only want this to run when this first comes onto the page, which means we want the dependency array to be empty like we see here. Now this will allow us to get the values of window.innerWidth and window.innerHeight when this first pops onto the page. But what if the user resizes the window? Well, we need to track that as well by saying window.addEventListener, and we'll say when it resizes, then we want to run a function to basically do the same thing, re-get our values and set those again. And we can just do that by going ahead and simply copying and pasting these and putting them down here. So we can say when the window resizes, we're just going to set the inner width to the new window.innerWidth, and we're going to set the inner height to the new window.innerHeight. Okay, this is all well and good. We have the size of the window, but now we need where the cursor is on the window, and that's going to be, and we're going to save that to, instead of state, we're going to save that to motion values. Now, the reason we save the cursor position to a motion value is because that's going to be something that's going to change a lot. I'm going to get a lot of those events as I move around the window. So I want to make sure that it's not slowing my frame rate and it's allowing my animations to be smooth. So how I'll do that is I'll say const client X is going to be equal to use motion value, and we're going to give that a default value of 0. And the same thing is going to be true for the Y value. So const client Y is going to be equal to use motion value, and that's also going to be equal to a default value of 0. Let's make sure those are on the page as well, or they're imported by saying use motion value, and ensuring that we have those in our import values that we're getting from Framer Motion. Now that we have those motion values there, let's go ahead and listen to the mouse position with another use effect. So I'm going to drop another use effect on the page, and that use effect hook, we're going to give that an empty dependency array for now. That use effect hook is going to listen to every time the mouse moves, and then it's going to update our client X and client Y values. Let me go ahead and say window.add event listener for mouse move. And then when that changes, we want to grab that event. So I'm going to add my E here for the event itself, and we'll say client X.set, and that's going to be the event.client X. And of course, we'll do the same thing with Y. So we'll say client Y dot set, and that's going to be equal to event dot client Y. So essentially, we're getting the mouse move position in the X direction and the Y direction, and basically just setting them to the motion values that we've created. And that's allowing us to be able to get the current mouse position. Now that we have both the height and width of our window, as well as the client X and Y position, let's go ahead and take a look at what those values are so we can start to understand what they actually mean. And then we can start to implement some type of transformation that allows us to say, as the cursor is going across the screen, we're going from 0 to 1. And as it's going down the screen, we're going from 0 to 1. So we want to do both of those things, but we want to understand what these values actually are. So I'm going to use a special export from Framer Motion called use motion value event. And what this essentially does is we can look at any of these motion values like client X or client Y. So we'll look at client X in this example, and we'll say when it changes, go ahead and give us the latest value in a function that allows us to basically use that latest value. Well, all I'm going to do with that value is I'm going to go ahead and console log it. So I'm going to say console.log, and we'll say client X, and we'll go ahead and output that latest value that it gives us. So every time that client X changes, it should go ahead and console log this latest value. Now, if we pull up our dev tools, we can pull up this bottom bar here in our browser, and we can navigate over to edit and then dev tools, and that will allow us to use that for a specific pane. Now, I have the laptop one selected right now, so I can see what's going on in my laptop view as the mouse moves around the screen. Now you can see as soon as my mouse hovers over this, that my values start to change. So as I go over all the way over here, you can see that I get over to 1200 pixels because essentially that's the width of the screen. And as I get over to the left, then I go down to 0. So that's what I'm essentially tracking, is the number of pixels that my mouse has moved versus the width of the screen. So it goes from 0 over to my 1200 pixels over on the right. The same thing is going to be true for my Y value. So I could also do the same thing and track my Y value. So let me go ahead and change this to client Y. And let me go ahead and say client Y here, just so we can see that it is actually the client Y that's updating. So after I save that and then update this, as I move from top to bottom, I should see that this value also changes as well. So this screen right now is about 800 pixels. So that's what it's going to transition to down at the bottom. And then at the top, it's going to be near 0. So that's what those values are. And of course, the inner height and inner width are just representative of the screen size. So inner width is going to be 1200 pixels in this screen size, and then inner height is going to be 800 pixels in this screen size. So now that we know what those values are, now we can start to transform them to say, okay, instead of 800 and 1200, all of that, I want to just say basically as my mouse moves from left to right, I want it to transition from 0 to 1. And we can use transform to go ahead and transform those values. So I'm going to say const x progress is going to be equal to use transform. So I'm going to look at the client x value, and as it goes from 0 to whatever my width of the screen is, so inner width, I'm going to transform this value from 0 to 1. So essentially, as my mouse goes across the screen, I want a value that gives me somewhere between 0 and 1, and I'm going to save that to my x progress value. I want to do the same thing with y progress, so I'm going to say const y progress, and that's going to be equal to use transform. of my client Y value. And as it goes from 0 to inner height, then I want it to transition from 0 to 1. And then we can just export those X progress and Y progress values at the bottom of this hook. So we have this custom hook called use mouse position. I'm going to return X progress and Y progress, and those will be what I'll use inside of my component, if I can spell that correctly. So now we have this custom use mouse position. Now we can go ahead and import it into our component. So we can say use mouse position, and of course that's going to give us the X progress and Y progress values. So I can say const X progress and Y progress, and those are going to be numbers that are going to be tracking the position of the cursor on the screen. I'm going to close out my console. So now that we have that, what we can do is we can basically transform these values into how much we want these planets to move. So to do that, what we can do is use another use transform, and then we can translate these planets in both the X and Y direction. So I'm going to do that for my translation, but I'm going to translate the small planets differently than I do the big ones. So I'm not going to move the big ones very much. I'm going to move the medium one a different amount, but the small ones are going to move the most. So it's going to kind of give some variation to these planets as they move across the screen. So let's start with the large ones. I'm going to say translate large X, or const translate large X, I should say, is going to be equal to a use transform of my X progress value. And as it goes from 0 to 1, I'm going to want to go from negative 25% to 25%. So just basically moving these planets by up to 25% of their current size in the X direction. Of course, I'm going to have to make one for the Y direction as well. So I'm going to say const translate large Y, and that's going to be equal to a similar thing, use transform, but this time looking at the Y progress value. And as it goes from 0 to 1, I'm going to want to go from, once again, negative 25% to 25%. Then I need to wrap my planets in this translation so that we can see this happen as our mouse moves across the screen. So let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to go ahead down to my planets and see if we can then use these different translations. So what we then need to do is go ahead and wrap these large planets in a motion div that will allow us to translate these based on the mouse position. So I'm going to wrap these in a motion.div. I'm going to put the ending one after my first planet here. And then I'm going to go ahead and set the style to my X position, which is going to be my translate large X, and my Y position is going to be my translate large Y. And let's see if this works after I save this. So after I save this, I'm going to go ahead and move my mouse across the screen a little bit. And yes, you can see that that planet is moving a little bit with my cursor. So that's a nice little effect. I like where that's going so far. So let's go ahead and continue to implement this with my other large planet. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this because essentially we're going to do the exact same thing for my other large planet. Let me go ahead and take the ending motion div, wrap it around my other large violet planet, and go ahead and hit save, and let's see what happens to this one as well. Now that we've done that, we can see that both of our planets do move along with the cursor, although I think the movement of these planets is a little bit too uniform, and so I'd like to add a little bit of springiness to this translation. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the top of my file, and I'm going to implement a spring using Framer Motion's use spring. So what this is going to do is, instead of just directly translating it in a very uniform manner, it's going to give it a little bit of springiness, for lack of a better word. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say use spring, and that use spring is going to take in my X progress value. So I'm going to take in my X progress value. And in this case, we'll just say const spring X. And then we can pass that into where we were using our X progress transform before, and now it'll give it a little bit of springiness. So let me show you what this looks like now if I save my page and go back onto here and go ahead and hover. You can see that instead of it immediately translating along with my mouse, now I have just a little bit of springiness in the X direction where it's moving along with it, but it's doing it with a little bit of a delay and a little bit of a more disconnected feel. So it doesn't feel like it's directly tied to my mouse. It just feels like it has some springiness in that motion. So I'd like to do the same thing for my Y value. So I'm going to say const spring Y, and that's going to be equal to use the spring of the Y progress value. And then I'm going to replace the Y progress in my use transform with spring Y instead. So this will give a little bit of springiness to my Y value as well. So you should see that it's not, you should see that while it's following my mouse, it doesn't feel like it's tied with a wire or anything like that. It just gives it a little bit more of a nice transition. So now that we've done that, we'd like to move our other planets as well. So let's go ahead and create some other translated values. So I'm going to say const translate medium X, and this is going to be for my medium-sized planet. I'm going to say use transform, and essentially I'm going to transform my spring X again, but in this case, as it goes from 0 to 1, I'm going to change the values from negative 50% to 50%. So this is a little bit bigger of a translation, and the same thing is going to be true in the Y direction. So I'm going to say const translate medium Y, and that's going to be equal to use transform spring Y, and we'll say as that goes from 0 to 1, we want to go from negative 50% once again to 50%. And after I save that, let me go ahead and wrap my medium planet in that value. So I'm going to come down to my planets, wrap my medium teal planet down here in a motion.div. So I'm going to say motion.div. Go ahead and take the ending one and paste it after my planet. And then I'm going to say style equals X is going to be translate medium X, and Y is going to be translate medium Y. And let me save that and let me see what my teal planet does now that I've put that in place. So you can see that my teal planet is moving a little bit more than my purple planets are. So that's a good sign, and it still has that springiness to that motion. So I like how that's looking. So let's go ahead and change our small fuchsia planet and go ahead and add some values for it as well. So coming back up to the top of my file, I can basically just copy and paste what I've done here with my medium X and Y and just change the values. So I can say translate small x for my small planet and translate small y. And instead of moving that negative 50% and 50%, now it's going to go negative 200% to 200%. And the same thing is going to be true in the y direction. So we negative 200% to 200%. Okay, let me go ahead and down and then use those values. So let me come to my small fuchsia planet, wrap that in a motion.div. Go ahead and copy and paste that ending motion.div, and then set the style to X, which is going to be translate small x, and Y is going to be translate small y. And after I save that, let's go ahead and look at what happens with these different values. So I can see that as I move my mouse around, the fuchsia planet really has some movement there. I like what that looks like because it definitely catches the eye. So it's definitely going to make someone take a second look at this particular translation. So that is looking really good. And I think with that, we're finished with the animation for our hero section. Let's go ahead and move on to our companies section. In order to start working on the animation for our companies section, let's go into sections/companies and take a look at what we need to do in here. I'm just going to slide my browser window over a little bit and close my sidebar to have a better look. Now, each of our companies is wrapped in a div with a logo, and then we have this flexed none div right here, as well as this flex div that is making sure that we don't see any overflow. In order to get this to work, we're going to want to change this div right here, the one that's wrapping our logos themselves, to a motion.div, and then we're going to want to translate it in the negative x direction. So we're going to want to translate it to the left over a period of time. So let's first go ahead and start to create some of that effect, and then we'll see where that kind of falls apart and fix the things as we come across them. So let me go ahead and import motion into this component. So I'm going to import motion from Framer Motion. And I also want to change this over to a client component because now we're introducing these client effects. So I'm going to say use client. And then down here, we're going to change this flexed div to motion.div. And we're going to say the same thing down here, ending motion.div. Now, in order to show you what we actually need to do, let me go ahead and add a quick style on here. So I'm going to say style equals, and then I'm just going to add an X value, and we're going to translate that negative 25% in the X direction and hit save and see what happens to this div right here. So after that happens, you can see that it has translated over to the left a little bit. So let's go to negative 50%. Let's see what that looks like. At negative 50%, we're still seeing this is our ending logo. So we're still seeing logos at negative 75%. Let me go ahead and save that. And you can see that we're then getting to the point where we don't have any more logos showing on the screen. So essentially, in order to create this effect, we're going to have another set of logos coming behind our original set in order to show something on the screen as we translate this in the X direction in order to make this look like a smooth effect. So instead of mapping over our companies the way that we're doing it, what we'll have to do is we'll have to create an array where we map over our companies twice. And what we can do is we can spread our companies by saying ... companies. And then we can do that twice by once again saying ... companies. And this will create an array that's double the length of our original companies array. It'll just be spreading our companies array out into a new array twice. And then we can map over each of those and then show our logos. Now, we don't want to use the key of name because now we're going to be repeating that name. So the best thing we really have is the index, the array index of our logo. So I'm just going to say R index for the array index. And then we're going to use that as our new key because that is a unique value at that point. And then we can just, I guess, pull back our name and not show that on the screen anymore. So after I do that, let me go ahead and see what happens when we do the same thing. So you saw we were at negative 75%. Let's come back to 0%. So that should be back to the original translation. And let's go to negative 25% and see what that looks like. And you can see that we're already seeing our last value. And that's because now that we have an array that's double the length, instead of having to go to negative 100% to get it all the way over, now we only have to go to negative 50%, and then we need to repeat that. So at negative 50%, we should see basically the start of the second array. So we should see everything kind of aligned to the way it originally was on the screen, which is exactly what we want to see. So as we go from 0 to negative 50%, basically that second array is going to show. It's going to end up exactly at the start of where the first array was. And then we can just repeat that and it will look like an infinite effect. So let's go ahead and try and make that happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove my style because I don't need that anymore. I was just using that as a demonstration. We do have our doubled companies array, so we will need to have that in place. And then we're just going to use some animation on our motion div. So we're going to say that the initial position is going to be where X equals 0. We're going to say it's going to animate to a position where X is equal to negative 50%. And then after we do that, let's go ahead and see what that looks like if I go ahead and save my page. So let me reload that once again and see what happens. And you can see that it happens, but it happens very quickly. And of course, it only happens once. We want to change some of that. And we can change that with the transition prop. So I'm going to set my transition prop here. And I'm going to say that we want to have the duration of this. Let's go ahead and slow this down just so we can see what's happening. So we're going to set the duration to 10. Go ahead and hit save and see if we can see this happen over 10 seconds instead of like 1 second. So you can see that you can see this happening, but it needs to be infinite and it needs to be linear, which means that we don't want it speeding up or slowing down at any point in time. So we're going to change those as well. We're going to say repeat infinity, and that'll make it happen forever. We're going to change the ease to linear, and then let's look at this animation again after we save our page. So after we've saved this, essentially what I'm looking for is I'm looking for this first logo that's coming across the screen here. I'm looking for a smooth transition as this transitions out. And I didn't see any kind of jump or anything, which means that essentially what we've created here by animating from 0 to negative 50% is an infinite loop transition. So you don't see it, but essentially it's immediately going back to 0 and then animating to negative 50% again, going back to 0 and an immediate cut, and then animating to negative 50% again. That's just happening over and over and over. This gives this smooth, infinite feel to this particular section. So let's see this on all of our different screen sizes. So this is the desktop size, but as I go over to the tablet size and scroll up, you can see that that's looking great on that size as well. And then the same thing is true as I go over to mobile and look at this. Obviously, you don't get as many logos, but I'm still seeing that great, perfect looping effect on all of my screen sizes. So the more I looked at this, the more I realized there is a little bit of a jump in our mobile view as we scroll back to the start of our logos. And that is because we have a little bit of a mismatch in our padding and our gap in between our logos. So right now you can see that there's a gap of 18 or a gap of 4.5 rems or 72 pixels between our logos at the mobile size. But we also have padding left and right of 72 pixels. That padding, if it's going to work correctly, needs to be half of whatever our gap is so that it can essentially fill in the space between the starting and ending logo. So instead of PX18 at the mobile size, I need this to be PX9. And then when it moves up to the tablet size where we change our gap, we can then change it over to PX18. So let me go ahead and save that and see if we still see that jump that I was seeing before in our logo transition. So I'm going to look at this one more time. Let me see this go through all of the logos and then get to where I'm seeing my last logo. That's this one right here, and see if we see a jump. And now we don't. And that's because we've corrected the issue that we had with our padding on the left and right sides at our mobile view. Now that we've done that, it's time to move down to our feature section and see what kind of animations we're going to put in here. Now that we're done with our company's animation, let's go ahead and move down to this feature section and look at the animation that we want to create for this orbit. So we can open up our features section and take a look at this. Essentially what we want to do is we want to rotate these company logos, and every so often we would like to go ahead and stop on a logo and then rotate to the next one, stop on that one, rotate to the next one, and stop on that one. In order to implement that, let's go ahead and bring in Framer Motion and talk about what we can do to make that happen. So I'm going to go to the top of my file, of course, change this over to a client component by using the use client directive, and then I'm going to bring in my Framer Motion by saying import motion from Framer Motion. And then after we've done that, we can start to animate some of the content in this section. So what I have right here is my logos are right here. So I have an outer div that is controlling the rotation of the whole circle of logos. And then my inner div is basically ensuring that my logo stays upright as I'm rotating my logos. Now we are already transforming this outer div, and we are also already transforming this inner div. So what I think I'm going to have to do is make sure that as we are rotating these, that we don't lose any of these transform styles. So I'll show you how to do that here in a second. So let's go ahead and change a couple of these over. So let's go ahead and change first this div right here, our outer logos one, to motion.div, and then we'll update the ending tag to motion.div as well, and go ahead and save that. And then what I'd like to do for this one is I'd like to go ahead and change this transform or this rotation to a couple of values using our animate prop. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out for a second. And then I'm going to set the animate prop, and we're going to say rotate. And then we're going to use a couple of keyframes. So I have these logos mapped. There's 8 different logos. They each have their own rotation value, their initial rotation value. So I'd like to key off of whatever that is and then rotate it by 360 degrees. So we're going to start at whatever our rotation value is. Then we're going to go to, for now, just rotate plus 180. And then we're going to go to rotate plus 360. And I'll show you in a second why I stopped at that 180 degrees. So let me go ahead and save this and see what happens when we do this animation. And let's go ahead and slow that down a little bit so we can see what's taking place. So I'm going to set my transition prop on this. I'm going to say that that is equal to duration of 10 seconds. And let's go ahead and see what happens when we set that as well. And I'm going to speed that up a little bit to 5 seconds just so we can get a better look. So I'll save that again, and let's take another look at what's happening as we go around our circle. So you can see that it pauses in the middle at my 180. What I would like to do is have this go to a value, stop there, and then go to the next value. And it kind of does that based on the easing, but let's go ahead and instead of rotate 180, let's actually do that twice. So I'm going to say rotate plus 180, and then I'm going to say rotate plus 180 again. And that should stop at the 180 for one of the keyframes, and then it should go on to the 360. So let's go ahead and save that and see that particular transition happen. Okay, so in that case, it goes to the 180, it stops, and then it goes to the 360. I'm also saying that we need to make sure our initial rotation value is set so that we don't have them grouped all at the start when our animation is loading. So I'm going to say initial, and that's going to be equal to a rotation value of whatever our current rotation value is. So rotate equals rotate. And that should make sure that our orbit doesn't look messed up when it first loads on the page before it does that initial rotation. So you can see it doing that initial rotation. It stops at 180 and then it goes all the way over to 360. Now this works well, but what I'd like to do is have it stop on every single logo. So I'd like to rotate it by about 45 degrees, get this next one to stop, rotate it by another 45 degrees, get this next one to stop, and kind of have that going the whole time. So in order to do that, instead of rotating by 180, I need to say rotate with my initial. It's going to go to rotate plus 45. Then it's going to stop at rotate 45. So I'm going to say rotate plus 45 again. And then the same thing, rotate plus 90, and then stop at that and rotate plus 90 again, and then continue on. So let's see what that looks like, and then we can continue to fill in our values with these different values that we have. So that's a much smoother animation for those initial logos. Let me go ahead and reload that again so we can look at that one more time. You're going to see that my Slack logo, you can see that for my Google Cloud logo and for my Jira logo, you can see that those stop over here on the left. That's exactly what I want. So we're going to have to fill in all of the values between 0 and 360 going in 45-degree increments. So the next one's going to be rotate plus 135, rotate plus 135 again to get it to have 2 keyframes there, then 180, and then we're going to go on to 225. So rotate plus 225. Same thing again, rotate plus 225. Then we're going to have 270. So rotate plus 270 and rotate plus 270. And then we're going to go to 315. So rotate plus 315, rotate plus 315, and then we're going to go to 360. And since we still want it to pause on that 360, we still need 2 values here. So rotate plus 360 again. And as soon as I save that, let's see what this animation looks like over here. So we'll let this load for a second, and then we'll see what our feature section looks like. So you can see that now we're pausing on the left for each logo as we go around the circle. So let me reload that one more time so we can get a better look at that. But you'll see the pause, 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 pause all the way around the circle. And we'd like that to happen infinitely. So let's go ahead and set our transition to make sure that that happens. And of course, we'll slow this down a little bit. So we're going to go to a duration of 10 seconds. We're going to repeat this infinitely. So we're going to say repeat infinity. And then let's go ahead and save that and see what happens when we add those values in there. So you can now see that it is rotating and stopping on every logo. And then after the Slack logo, it should continue to rotate because now we've said repeat infinity. And that's looking good. The only thing I don't like is that as we're rotating around, our logos are staying in one spot. They're not staying upright. So this cloud logo is kind of turned sideways. The Notion logo is turned sideways. So in order to get this to work, what we essentially need to do is we need to rotate this div in the negative direction equal to the rotation that we've added up here in the positive direction in order to get all these logos to continue to face upright as this spins. So we'll go ahead and remove this style comment and come down and also create a motion div out of this one. So I'm going to say motion.div for the second div, ending motion.div. So this will be the nested one. And then for this one, we need to say that the initial value is going to be equal to this transform translate. So let's go ahead and set this transform. Just going to go ahead and copy and paste that and have my ending backtick. And we also want to set it to the rotate as well. So the rotate is going to be equal to negative rotate. And then let me go ahead and take off my style because we won't need that anymore. And then as we animate around, we're essentially going to do exactly what we did here, where we're going to have keyframes, but they're going to be in the negative direction. So instead of adding 45 degrees, we're going to subtract 45 degrees. So let's go ahead and change that by just going ahead and copying this, pasting it into our internal motion.div, and then we're going to go ahead and select all of our rotates by using Command D on the Mac or probably Control D on Windows. And then we'll say this is going to be negative rotate. And we're also going to select our plus signs and make them minus signs. So I'm going to select the plus signs and say minus 45, minus 90. And after we save that, let's see what that looks like as our orbit continues to rotate. So it's refreshing the page. It should come back up to the feature section here in 1 second, and then we should see this happen. Now what you'll see is that even though our logos are now upright when they come around to the main left side of our spheral logo, they're still not staying upright as they go around our orbit. And that's essentially what we wanted to happen. Now, the reason for that is because we're setting this transform here when essentially what we should be setting is a translate value, because we want it to change our rotate independently of our translate value. And those are two things that transform does. So we can't set transform here. That actually doesn't make any sense. So let's go ahead and set translate instead. And we're going to change this to negative 50% with no comma in between, negative 50%. And that should set our translate independently of our rotate so that they don't affect each other. So let me go ahead and save that again, and let's see if we see anything changing with our animation. So after it loads, we should see the feature section pop back up, and hopefully we see that it changes. Now it did change, but the problem is it didn't change infinitely. So we essentially need to copy and paste what we're doing with the transition up here down to what we're doing with the transition in our second motion.div to get this to repeat infinitely and have the same duration. After the page loads again, you can see that now our logos are staying upright as they go around this orbit. And this is exactly the effect we wanted to create, was that our logos all look right as they go around the orbit. They're not upside down, they're not sideways, they're just upright. And we did that by essentially setting the outside rotation to a positive value and then setting the inside rotation to a negative value. And those offset and made sure that our logos looked right all the way around that orbit. And then when we set the equal transitions, so we set the transition for the inside one equal to what we set the transition for the outside one, then we have this nice effect that we currently see here. So I really like where this is at. This is an infinite effect, so it will continue happening as the user looks at this section, and it definitely catches the eye. So with this animation done, let's go ahead and move on to the next section of the page. Now that we've finished up our features section animation, let's go ahead and move down to our pricing section and talk about what we would like to happen for this section. Now for this section, what we'd like to do is we'd like to have the button animate when we hover this button. But instead of just making this for the pricing section, we can actually make this for any of our primary buttons that have this gradient border. We can actually make this rotate when the button is hovered. So let's go ahead and go into our button component and talk about how we can make that happen. I'm going to close out my sidebar so we can get a little bit of a better look. And we know that since we're going to be bringing in some of the motion animations, that we're going to need to come in here and make sure this is also a client component by using the use client directive. And that use client directive will ensure that this can be rendered on the client. And of course, they can render all the JavaScript and the interaction that we need it to. Now, ultimately, when this button is hovered, we're going to need to know that because we want to start and stop our animation based on when the button is hovered. So that's the first thing we'll need to do, is be able to save the state of whether or not the button is currently hovered. So I'm going to use my use state hook. So I'm going to say use state from React, and we're going to save this to a constant value of is hovered and set is hovered. And then we'll set the default value of that, of course, to false. So then in order to set that value, what we can do is we can come into our button and add a prop of on mouse enter. And then we can say if when that happens, we'll set is hovered to true. And then when we leave, so on mouse leave, then we'll set is hovered to false. So set is hovered false. At that point, we should have an is hovered state that is either true or false based on whether our mouse is over this button. Now remember, this button component has a lot of variance. So even though we'll be saving this is hovered state, we're only really going to be animating the gradient border when this is a primary button. So we'll just want to keep that in mind as we're building out this component. The next thing that we'll have to do for this component is we'll have to make it a motion button instead of a normal button in order to be able to animate this with a motion value. So I'm going to import motion from framer motion, and then I'm going to change this into a motion.button. And of course, my ending button tag, I'm going to change into a motion.button as well. That will enable us to go ahead and animate this with a motion value. Now let's look at how this gradient is actually set up. So I'm going to go into my sidebar. I'm going to go into assets.
I'm going to go into app and I'm going to go into globals.css and take a look at how this gradient is actually set up. So when we apply this border gradient class, what we actually end up doing is applying this background linear gradient. And you can see that it has this internal gradient of just gray 950 to gray 950, giving it that internal color of the same color as the background. But then we have this conic gradient, which is a circular gradient that goes from 45 degrees and then follows this path of violet to fuchsia to amber and then to teal and back to violet. Now, essentially to animate this, essentially what we need to do is animate this degree value. If we can get this to go from 45 degrees to 360 degrees plus 45 degrees, then we can animate this in a circular fashion. So essentially that's what we need to do, is animate this background value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually copy and paste this background value. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, come into my button.tsx, and I'm just going to paste this into a comment so I can use this value when we need to use the value. And essentially what I do is I'm going to also save the current angle of that gradient in a motion value. So I'm going to say const angle is equal to use motion value, and that's going to start at 45 because we know that our angle is going to have a starting value of 45 degrees. So I need to import that. Let's make sure that's imported. If I come up here, I can import this use motion value hook from Framer Motion. That will allow me to use that. And it's not used yet, but we're going to use this angle to set the value of our background. Now to then use this motion value, I can use another function provided by Framer Motion called use motion template. So I'm going to say const background is going to be equal to use motion template. And that motion template is just going to allow us to use a motion value inside some sort of style rule. So I'm going to copy my linear gradient here. Go ahead and paste it inside of my motion template and see what we need to change, because this isn't Tailwind CSS. We're actually setting a style value here. So linear gradient, this is all fine. We can use these CSS variables that we're setting. We don't need this underscore here. That will mess up our rule. And then we have this conic gradient, which we can put a space in between here, and we can say from. And this is where we're going to insert our angle motion value. So I'm going to say from angle degrees. And then it's going to go through color violet, color fuchsia, color amber, color teal, back to color violet. And of course, we don't need an underscore here. We can just use a space for our border box. So after we've done that, we should have a motion template or a style value that changes based on the degrees of our motion value. And we can actually test that very quickly by just going ahead and setting that background on our motion button. And then we can just change this motion value and see what happens when we do that. So I'm going to say style equals background, and that's going to be equal to our background value, but only if our variant is primary. So actually we need to do this a little bit differently. We need to say props dot variant. If it's equal to primary, then we'll go ahead and give it this background equals background. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and give it a value of undefined. So that is only setting this background if it is a primary variant button. So let me go ahead and save that. We shouldn't see any changes right now over here to our buttons, which of course we don't. But if I change this to something like 90 degrees, we should see a change in our button gradient. So let's see if we see that after we save this and refresh the page. Let me go ahead and refresh the page and see if that button looks any different than it did before. So yes, it does look different. We see that fuchsia is now right at the bottom. And if we set this to like, let's say 180 degrees, we should see that button continue to change along with that motion value. So I'm gonna go ahead and refresh this one more time and see if we see a change. And yes, now our fuchsia gradient is over here in this corner. So we know that this is working. This motion template is taking this motion value and inserting this and changing our conic gradient based on the angle that we have set. So let's set this back to 45 and let's see how we can change this based on whether or not the button is hovered. In order to do that, we need to use an effect. So I'm going to say use effect here, and that's going to take in a function. We're going to change this anytime is hovered changes. So if is hovered changes, then of course we're going to rerun this function. So we're going to say if this is hovered, then we're going to animate our angle to whatever our angle is plus 360. And this animate function is actually something that comes directly from Framer Motion as well. And make sure this is on the page. Let me go ahead and re-import that. And let's go ahead and click that. That should import that at the top of my file. And then we can also change the transition and how this happens. So it should go from angle to, actually, this should be angle.get plus 360. So we're animating this motion value. We're getting the current value, whatever it is. We're going to plus 360 degrees of that. And then we're setting the duration to 1 second for now, the ease to linear, and the repeat to infinity. So that should ensure that as long as we're hovered, we should be animating this rotation over 1 second, 360 degrees. And actually, let me go ahead and slow that down a little bit. Let me go ahead and change that to 2 seconds. And let me go ahead and save that. Now let me make sure use effect is on the page as well. So let me go ahead and say use effect again and just make sure that's imported from React. And is hovered should be true. Okay, so it's missing the dependency of angle. That's fine. We can add that in there as well. So we'll go ahead and save that with angle in there. So after I've done that, let's see if we hover a button, what happens to that button. So let me scroll down to my pricing section and go ahead and hover over my primary button and see if we see the angle beginning to change. And yes, indeed we do. We see that the fuchsia is rotating around. We see the green rotating around. So that is animating that angle right now. So that's a really good look for that particular button. We can speed this up a little bit if we want to. Let me try this at a duration of 1 second and see if we like that any better. So I'm going to come back after we refresh the page and see if that looks any better as well. After that refreshes and I hover, you can see that that's a pretty fast effect. So actually, I think I like where that's at because it's definitely more eye-catching than the 2 second effect. So I'm going to leave that at the 1 second, and that's going to be what that is. Now, this continues to animate even after we remove our mouse, even after is hovered is false. So we need to reset the animation back to the original angle after that happens. So what we can do is we can say, if it is hovered, then we animate using this function. Otherwise, we're going to animate that angle back to the original value of 45 degrees. And we're just going to do that over a duration of 0.5 seconds. So I'll set duration to 0.5 there. And then we'll go ahead and save that. Go ahead and refresh our page and see what happens with that angle after that happens. I'm going to zoom this back into 100% because I know this is a pretty small button to look at, especially on a smaller screen. So I'm going to zoom that back in and take a look at what happens when I hover my button. So now that it's hovered, I am seeing it spin, but as soon as I remove my mouse, you can see it animates back to that original position. And this should happen for all primary buttons. So it should happen for this one as well. I should see an animation after I hover this one. And since it's not happening, that means we need to relook at our button code to ensure that every button that is a primary variant button is going to have that animation. And I think that's actually because we have this default variant set to primary, but we're not actually setting the default prop variant to primary. And what that means is it's getting the styles of that default variant, but down here, we're looking at the specific prop value. So we're saying if the props.variant is primary, then we're doing that background animation. So we need to basically go ahead and pull out the variant here. And then we need to set a default value by saying equals primary. And then we can come down here and we can adjust things based on that. So let's go ahead and change this. Instead of props.variant, this is going to be equal to variant. We can say the same thing with this. We need to drop the variant value into our classes. And then if we save that, we should have then added a default variant value of primary, which means that this button then would have that effect as we hovered it. And I can see that that is definitely true. So let's go ahead and scroll up to the top and see if our main sign up button has the same effect, and it looks like it does. So all of those primary buttons right now have a great effect. It's a little micro interaction type effect, but it's really a nice effect when that happens. And of course, we have that smooth animation back to that original button. So it's not just a hard cut, but rather it is animating back to that original 45 degree for our conic gradient. So this is a really great look for this button. I like where this is at. And with that, we can move on to our next section where we can do some more animations. Now that we've created a micro interaction for our button hover, let's go ahead, scroll down and go to the testimonials section. So this is something that we would like to animate between our different testimonials. Let's open up that section. Let's go to sections/testimonials. Go ahead and put in our sidebar. I'm also going to toggle word wrap on my code so we can see all of the code that we have available to us. And then we're going to look at this section to see how we can animate this between the different testimonials. Now, right now, we only have one testimonial that's able to be selected. We haven't yet linked up our dots so that they select that particular testimonial. So I think that's the first thing I'd like to do is make sure that we have the individual testimonials able to be selected. So we're going to save state to our testimonials with the current selected index. And in order to do that, we of course need to use the use client directive. So I'm going to come to the top of my file and say use client. And then inside of my testimonials, and I'm going to say const testimonial index set testimonial index, and we're going to set that to use state from React, and I can import that by just hitting enter when that use state pops up, and we'll set that to a default value of 0. So we can essentially replace this constant that we have here with our new state value. So I'm going to remove my selected testimonial index, and I'm going to start using then my current testimonial index from use state. Now, in order to replace this, all I'm going to do is replace selected testimonial index with my testimonial index. And so when it's equal to my current index in my map, then we're going to show this block quote. Otherwise, we're not going to show anything at all. So it's going to map over these, find the current one, and then it's going to show that as my quote. Now, in order to change that to 2, 3, and 4, because of course we're just after I save that, it looks like we have an error and it looks like we're still using that selected testimonial index somewhere, and it looks like it's down here. So let's change this one as well. We're going to say testimonial index. If it's equal to the index, when we're mapping over for the dots, then we show our border gradient. Otherwise, we just show the dot itself. So let's go ahead and save that one more time and see if that error goes away. After my page reloads, let me come down to my testimonials one more time, and we see that we don't have an error anymore, and we should be able to select one of these dots and actually see the testimonial change. Now, we can't currently do that because we haven't set a click handler on these dots. So we need to be able to do that as well. Let me go ahead and set an on click handler, and we're going to create a function that runs, and essentially that function is going to set the testimonial index to the current index that we're looping over. So it's going to be the current one that we have here. So if we click the first one, it's going to set this to 0. If we click the second one, it should set it to 1, 2, and 3. So let's go ahead and try that by clicking the last one, and you can see that it instantly flips over to that last testimonial. And the same should be true for our other testimonial. So this is number 2, this is number 3, and of course we also have number 4. We don't want it to be an instant transition though. We would like this to transition smoothly between one state to the next. So let's figure out how we can do that with Framer Motion. Now it's just a small effect, but the first thing I'm going to look at is this gradient border. We can actually change this border so that it's not an instant change, but it actually transitions to the position that I get set at when one of these testimonials gets changed. So I'm going to do that by going ahead and changing this over to a motion.div. I'm not sure if we have motion imported yet, so let me go ahead and try and start using it. It doesn't look like we do, so let me go into the top of my file and import motion from Framer Motion, and then we should be able to change that over to a motion.div. So let me scroll back down to my gradient border div here, and I'm going to say motion.div, and I'm going to replace, of course, the ending tag with motion.div as well. After I've saved that, nothing should change yet, but what will make this happen is if I give this a layout ID. So the layout ID is what's going to allow this to change position when the testimonial index changes. So I'm going to say layout ID is equal to testimonial dot. And then after I save that, let me see what happens when I click through my testimonials now. And now you'll see that the border gradient is actually translating position to the different selected testimonials. So it's a nice little effect that we can add there, but of course we can go a lot further than that, and we can make sure that our dots aren't shifting position on us either, because that's adding a little bit of a jolt that we don't want the user to see either. In order to remove that jolt, what I think I need to do is basically just go ahead and remove my justify center rule from my dot flex class. So let me go ahead and save that, and it should move my dots up towards the top of my image. And let me also just double check that we don't have that same thing happening up here. So this is, I think, is also setting my dots towards the center. We actually want them moved towards the top so that they don't change position when we transition between different testimonials. So let me try this again. So go to 2, 3, and 4. And now you can see it's a perfectly smooth transition between those different states, and it looks really nice. Now that we've got that in place, the other thing that we can do is we can animate the presence in and out of these block quotes. So essentially when our testimonial index changes, we're removing a block quote from the DOM and we're adding a new block quote that has a new key, a new quote, all of that. So essentially what we'd like to be able to do is we'd like to be able to animate the presence of our block quote, be able to animate one out and then the next one in to give it a nice smooth animation. So in order to do that, we can come up to the top of our file. We're going to import animate presence. And animate presence is what will allow us to set those exit and enter animations. And then we can just wrap our block quote with animate presence. And then we can just wrap our entire testimonials map with animate presence. And that will allow us to animate in and out anything that changes within this animate presence component. Now that we've done that, we should probably switch our block quote to a motion.block quote because essentially the block quote is what we would like to animate in and out. So I'm going to change this to a motion.block quote. And after I save this, we then have the ability to set enter and exit animations on our block quote. So what we'd like to do is go ahead and set an initial value, which is what happens before it has entered fully. And that's going to be opacity of 0. And we'd also like to set the Y value to 25 to just move it down a little bit. Then when it's all the way in, that'll be our animate value. So that's animate prop. We can set to opacity 1. So it's going to be fully opaque at that point, fully shown. And then the Y value is going to be the default value of 0. And then when it exits, we can set an exit transition. And that's going to be opacity, once again, of 0. It's going to fade out. And then a Y value of 25. So it's going to move down when it exits the screen. And then we can just set the transition prop as well to control the duration of this animation. So for now, I'm just going to set the duration to 0.5. Now, when we save that, and then let's see what happens when I change my testimonial index. So let me go ahead over to the second one, and you can see the third one and the fourth one are animating in, but for some reason, they're not waiting for the other block quote to animate out before it animates in. So we need to change our animate presence component to allow this by setting the mode to wait. When we set the mode to wait, it should wait for the exit before it does the entrance of the next testimonial. So let's go ahead and give this a second to load and see what happens when we switch now. So it looks like the problem might be that we have a React fragment wrapping this testimonial index check, because we'd essentially like to have the child of this animate presence be a motion div or a motion block quote, but in this case, it is a React fragment. So let's see what happens if we remove our React fragment from both the top and bottom of our block quote. And then instead of having this parentheses and then going into here, let's just go ahead and directly say that if the testimonial index is equal to the index, then we go ahead and show this block quote. Otherwise, we just return null. So this should allow us to return a value. Let's go ahead and take that off, that extra parentheses that we have there. And we also need to take out that extra bracket that we have. So this should ensure that the motion.block quote is a direct child of animate presence, which hopefully should allow our animate presence to work a little better with entering and exiting. So let's try this again. Let's go to the next one. And you can see that, yes, indeed, our block quote has exited the screen before the next one tries to animate in. So we should see a nice smooth animation between those. As you can see, that is looking really nice. We just need to clean this up a little bit more. One of the things we'd like to do is not hide that initial animation while we wait for Framer Motion to load. So what we can do is we can set another prop on our animate presence. We can say initial equals false. And if we set that, it shouldn't then set the initial opacity to 0 for the first block quote. So it should just show it and then only transition when we change our testimonial. So if we go between them, then it fades out and in, but it shouldn't hide that initial one while it's loading. And we saw that with this page. I'm going to go ahead and refresh one more time so we can see that again. But now it's not hiding this block quote until Framer Motion loads on the page, which is definitely a good thing. Now, the last thing we want to do to ensure that this testimonial animation is as smooth as possible is to ensure that when we go to the different testimonials that we're not seeing a jolt or an instant change to the height of the box around our testimonials. We'd like that to smoothly transition to the height that we want it to be. So in order to do that, we need to use another feature of Framer Motion, which is to be able to set a layout animation for any motion components. In order to do that, we'd like to change this border gradient div to smoothly animate when the height changes. So I'm going to set this to a motion.div instead of a normal div, and then I can use my code folding to see where the ending div for that is. So I'm just going to replace that ending div with a motion.div. And then if we set the layout prop, the layout should hopefully smoothly animate the layout. Now, the problem that we're going to have is that even though this layout will transition, it's not going to realize that it should be transitioning based on the layout of our block quote. So we're going to have to wrap these both in a layout group. And I'll just show you real quick that this isn't going to work quite yet because we're transitioning the size of this, and this motion div has to transition along with it. So we're going to wrap this in a layout group. So this is a layout group component from Framer Motion. I'm going to fold this up again to see where I need to place my ending layout group. It's going to be right here, and can go ahead and unfold that. And then we also want to add a layout prop here in our motion block quote to say that both of these layouts need to be able to transition together. After I've done that and I save, let's go ahead and test this out after this loads so we can see if this is smoothly flowing together yet or not. And yes, as soon as we transition, you can see that our height is changing, but now it's smoothly changing instead of jolting the user between one state or another. Now, the problem is we also see that our dots are kind of shifting as we do this same transition. So we need to change the way that layout is working as well. So we'll change this wrapper, our dot wrapper, into a motion.div as well. We're going to replace the ending div down here with motion.div. And we want to say that the layout prop is also here, but in this case, we want to say that we're going to only be paying attention to the position. So we want the position to stay the same as the layout changes. So I'm going to go ahead and save that one more time, give my page a second to refresh, and then we can kind of test out and see how this works after we've set this layout prop. Now that this is loading, you can see that now our dots aren't shifting and our position, our height of this box is smoothly animating between one state and the next. So this right now is a really, really smooth transition. I love how this is happening. Let's go ahead and look at our different views to make sure that this is looking good across our different responsive views. Over in our tablet, as we scroll down, let's go ahead and shift this over as well. And let's see that this happens. And indeed, this transition is happening very smoothly as well. And then in our mobile view, we want to make sure that this is happening smoothly over in mobile as well. So I'm going to click over here and we can see that, yes, that does smoothly transition as well. So all of that is happening really, really nicely. I like how this animation turned out. Let me come back over to my desktop view where this is really on display. The user is going to love this one, but with this animation complete, we're going to move on. To get started animating this call to action section, let's open up our sections directory and go to our call to action.tsx. I'm going to close out my sidebar as well as toggling on word wrap so that y'all can see what's going on inside this section. Now we know that we're going to be animating our planets similarly to how we animated them in the hero section. So since we already know how to create that animation, let's go ahead up to our hero section, open that back up, and go ahead and see what we did that we can then use down in our call to action. I'm actually going to double click this to get this to stay open and then go and look at what we did in here. So essentially what we did is we used this custom hook of use mouse position, and then we used that to transform a spring value in a large, medium, and small size. So essentially we can kind of use what we did before. The easiest way to use our mouse position is to go ahead and export that. So I can import that directly into my call to action from this exported value here. And then I can then go ahead and just copy and paste essentially what I did down here with my spring values and my translated values. So I'm going to do that. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste actually all of the values here. I'm going to remove what I don't need, and I'm going to bring it down to my call to action. So coming down into my call to action, going ahead and putting in my sidebar again, I'm going to paste all of those values into the top of my call to action component. Now, a couple of things we need to instantly do. Number one, we need to change this with a use client directive over to a client component, and we need to import use mouse position from our hero. That's going to bring that in. We don't need any of these scroll effects, so I'm going to go ahead and remove all of that code by just going ahead and hitting backspace there. And then we need to bring in use spring and use transform from framer motion. So I'm going to import that by saying use spring and then also use transform from framer motion. After we've done that, we have these translate X and Y for large, medium, and small values. We can then just use a motion component around our planets to then translate our planets similarly to how we did in our hero. So let's come down to our planets and see how we can do that. This should be easy, but of course we need to import our motion component as well. So let me import motion from framer motion, and I can use that to wrap my planets and then translate them from my mouse position. So I'm going to say motion.div around my first planet. This planet is a large planet, so that means with my style, I'm going to say that the X value is going to be equal to translate large X, and the Y value is going to be equal to translate large Y. And let's see how that looks after we save that. So after I come onto my screen and give this a second to reload, it's telling me that use mouse position is not a function. And probably what that means is that I forgot to save my hero after I went ahead and put this export keyword here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save on that one more time, and let's see if that reloads and allows me to use my mouse position. So now that I've done that, let me come down to my call to action and go ahead and start moving my mouse around on the screen after I click. And you can see that, yes, indeed, it is moving that one planet that we've wrapped a motion div around. So let's go ahead and update our other planets now that we know that that works. I'm going to come back to my call to action and wrap my other large planet, which is this one right here, with the same motion div. So I'm going to copy the motion div I've created up here. I'm going to paste it around my other planet. And of course, I'm going to wrap that with an ending motion.div and hit save. And it should then update my values to be able to kind of spring follow my mouse the way that it's doing right here. Now that I've done that, let me go ahead and update my medium planets. So these are these two right here. We could do them at once if we wanted to by just basically going ahead and selecting both of our negative Z10 values here and going ahead and using some IDE magic to say motion.div for both of these. We're going to copy and paste both of those at once. And I'm going to come back up here and say that my style is equal to X, which is going to be translate medium X, and Y is going to be translate medium Y. For my small one, I can do something very similar by going ahead and selecting both of my planets, coming up to the line before it, adding in a motion.div, going ahead and cutting and pasting my ending motion.div around my planet, and then coming back up into the opening tag and saying style equals X, which is going to be translate small x, and of course the Y value is going to be translate small y. After I have that saved, let me give my browser a second to refresh, and then let me come onto the page and see what kind of an effect we have. So yes, we have a really nice looking effect right here. You can see that my small planets are moving quite a bit. My large planets are not moving as much. It kind of almost feels like there's a little bit more gravity with those large planets. I like how this animation has really added this nice visual effect to my call to action that just gives the user a little bit more time to pause and look at this site. Let me double check all of my responsive views to make sure that those are all still working well. So let me go ahead and see, even with my tablet view, this is working really nicely. And of course, in my mobile, we're not seeing any planets, so we're not going to see anything happening over there. With that, this entire page has been animated from our testimonials, of course, our call to action. We've done a micro interaction with our button hover effect. We have our rotating orbit around our spherical logo. We have our companies animating right to left. And of course, up in the hero section, we have a couple of different animations up here as well. So this really turned out really nicely. I hope you enjoyed this project. And of course, make sure and stick around, and I'll see you in the next video. Now that our project is complete, the next step is going to be to deploy it to the Vercel platform. And in order to do that, all we need to do is bring up our bottom panel, and we need to install the Vercel CLI that will let us deploy it to the Vercel platform. So all we need to do is run npm i-g Vercel and give that a moment, and that will install the Vercel CLI. After that's done to deploy our site, we just need to run the Vercel command. And after we hit enter, it will ask us a few questions. So first of all, do we want to set up and deploy the site? Yes, we do. We're going to select the project that we'd like to associate this with. We don't want to link this to an existing project, so that'll be a no. Our project name can stay the same, so I'll just hit enter there. The directory that the code is located is the current one, so // will work right there. And then it will set up our project and ask us if we would like to use the default build command, install command, and output directory. Since we don't want to modify those settings, we can just hit enter again, and it will deploy our site. After this process is done, you should get a production URL where you can go and look at your completed page. And as you can see, if I visit the URL that Vercel gave me, I've got the entire site up and running and available for the world to see. So I can put this on my portfolio. I can give this my own domain name. I can do anything I want with this site, but it's now available to the public for everyone to see.